For 8 years, Caleb Rowan sat alone at that corner table, a ghost among the living, nursing his whiskey and his guilt in equal measure. The whole town knew you didn't approach the quiet cowboy who'd once worn a marshal's badge. But on that bitter November evening in 1878, when Evelyn Mercer walked through those saloon doors with nothing but a worn valise and fierce determination in her hazel eyes, she broke every unspoken rule Bramble Creek had. She sat down without asking, and in that single defiant moment, she shattered the walls of a man who'd sworn never to let anyone in again. If you're watching from your city, whether it's New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, or anywhere across this great country, drop a comment below and let me know where this story finds you tonight. I want to see just how far Caleb and Evelyn's journey travels. The wind that swept through Bramble Creek, Montana territory that November evening in 1878 carried the kind of cold that sank into your bones and reminded you that winter was coming, whether you were ready or not. Inside the Silver Spur Saloon, the warmth from the pot-bellied stove barely reached the corners of the room, but it was enough to draw in the usual crowd of ranch hands, drifters, and townspeople seeking refuge from the encroaching darkness. Caleb Rowan sat where he always sat at the corner table farthest from the door, his back pressed against the wall, so he could see every entrance, every exit, every face that walked through. It was a habit born from years of wearing a badge, years of learning that the moment you let your guard down was the moment everything went to hell. The table was scarred with decades of knife marks and whiskey rings, and Caleb had added his own over the past 8 years, each one a silent marker of another solitary meal, another night survived. He was 34 years old, though the lines etched around his gray-blue eyes and the premature silver threading through his dark hair suggested a man who'd lived considerably longer. His face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a strong jaw perpetually shadowed with stubble, a mouth that rarely curved into anything resembling a smile. He wore the same clothes he always wore. Dark trousers, a faded blue shirt, a leather vest worn soft with age, and his gun belt, the Colt 45, sitting comfortable against his right hip like an old friend he couldn't quite bring himself to abandon. The bartender, Floyd Hutchins, a portly man with a magnificent handlebar mustache and kind eyes, had long since stopped asking Caleb if he wanted company or conversation. Every evening, like clockwork, Caleb would arrive just after sunset, order the same meal, steak, potatoes, whatever vegetables Ida had managed to coax from her garden, and a single glass of whiskey that he'd nursed throughout the entire meal. He'd eat slowly, methodically, his eyes constantly scanning the room, and then he'd leave exact payment on the table, nod once to Floyd, and disappear back into the night. "Man's like a damn statue," Floyd had once remarked to his wife Ida, who did most of the cooking. "Been 8 years, and I still don't know nothing about him except he pays on time and don't cause trouble." "He's hurting," Ida had replied, her woman's intuition seeing what her husband couldn't. "That's a man carrying something heavy, Floyd, something that's eating him alive from the inside." The townspeople of Bramble Creek had learned to give Caleb his space. They knew he'd been a deputy marshal once, that he'd ridden with Marshal Thomas Blackwood out of the Helena office, chasing outlaws and keeping the peace across the brutal expanse of Montana territory. They knew something had happened, something bad enough to make him turn in his badge and buy a small ranch 10 miles outside of town where he raised cattle and horses and lived alone in a cabin he'd built with his own hands. Some said he'd killed an innocent man. Others whispered about a woman who died because of him. A few speculated he'd gone soft, lost his nerve in a shootout. But nobody knew the truth because Caleb Rowan didn't talk about his past, and the few times someone had been foolish enough to ask the look in his eyes. Cold, distant, touched with something that might have been pain or might have been warning, had been enough to silence even the most curious tongue. On this particular November evening, the saloon was more crowded than usual. A group of ranch hands from the Double R had ridden in to celebrate the end of a successful cattle drive, their voices loud and their laughter louder as they downed beer and whiskey with equal enthusiasm. Old Doc Pritchard sat at his usual spot near the bar, working on his third glass of bourbon and arguing politics with Samuel Chen, who ran the general store and had opinions about everything from statehood to the price of flour. At a table near the center of the room, Margaret Sullivan, the town's most prominent widow and self-appointed guardian of propriety, held court with several other ladies from the church auxiliary. their teacups filled with coffee spiked with just enough whiskey to keep away the chill. They spoke in hushed tones about the new school teacher who was supposed to arrive any day now, replacing Miss Abernathy, who'd married a rancher from Billings and moved away last month. "I heard she's from back east," Mrs. Sullivan said, her voice carrying despite her attempt at discretion. "Philadelphia, I believe. Lord knows what she'll make of our little town." "If she's smart, she'll turn right back around," chuckled Edna Pritchard, the doctor's wife. "Remember that teacher we had 3 years ago lasted exactly 2 weeks before she claimed the rustic conditions were unbearable?" The women laughed, and Caleb tuned them out, focusing on his meal. He'd learned long ago how to be present in a room full of people, while simultaneously being completely separate from them, existing in a bubble of his own silence that nobody dared penetrate. Which is why he noticed immediately when the saloon door opened and the entire room seemed to pause, if only for a heartbeat. The woman who stepped through the doorway was a study in contrasts. She wore a traveling dress of deep forest green that had clearly seen better days. The hem was dusty, the fabric wrinkled from long hours of travel, but the cut and quality spoke of Eastern refinement of a world far removed from the rough-hewn reality of Montana territory. A matching green hat perched on her head slightly askew, and a few strands of honey-brown hair had escaped their pins to curl against her neck. She carried a worn leather valise in her right hand and a smaller bag in her left, and her hazel eyes, striking even from across the room, swept the interior of the saloon with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with a heart-shaped face that might have been called pretty if not for the stubborn set of her jaw and the intelligent intensity of her gaze. There was something almost severe about her features. A straight nose, full lips pressed into a thin line, high cheekbones that stood out sharply in the lamplight, but it was a severity born of self-possession rather than unkindness. Every eye in the saloon turned toward her. Women didn't typically walk into the Silver Spur alone, especially not women who clearly weren't from around these parts. The ranch hands from the Double R went silent mid-story. Mrs. Sullivan and her companions stopped their chattering teacups frozen halfway to their lips. Even Doc Pritchard paused in his bourbon-fueled political discourse to stare. Floyd stepped forward from behind the bar, wiping his hands on his apron, his expression caught between concern and confusion. "Ma'am, can I help you?" The woman set down her bags and straightened her shoulders, and Caleb could see the effort it took, could read the bone-deep weariness in the slight tremor of her hands and the pale cast to her skin. She'd been traveling for days, maybe weeks, and she was running on nothing but willpower and determination. "I'm looking for Mrs. Margaret Sullivan," the woman said, and her voice was surprisingly strong-cultured with the crisp consonants and rounded vowels of the Eastern educated class. "I was told I might find her here." Mrs. Sullivan rose from her table, her considerable bosom heaving with self-importance. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, and you are—" "Evelyn Mercer," the woman replied, moving toward Mrs. Sullivan with as much grace as her obvious exhaustion would allow. "I'm the new schoolteacher. I apologize for my appearance. The stage from Helena was delayed, and I've been traveling for the better part of 3 days. I was told you were holding a key to the teacherage." A ripple of excitement ran through the saloon. This was Bramble Creek's new schoolteacher. She was nothing like Miss Abernathy, who'd been a mousy, timid creature afraid of her own shadow. This woman had steel in her spine, that much was obvious, even to the casual observer. Mrs. Sullivan's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching approval. "Well, Miss Mercer, welcome to Bramble Creek. Though I must say the Silver Spur is hardly the appropriate place for a lady of your position." "I'm aware," Evelyn replied, a hint of dry humor touching her voice. "However, it's after dark. I'm unfamiliar with the town, and I saw the lights. I thought it prudent to ask for directions rather than wander the streets alone." "Quite sensible," Mrs. Sullivan conceded. She gestured toward her companions. "This is Mrs. Pritchard, Mrs. Chen, and Miss Abigail Harper. Ladies, this is our new schoolteacher, Miss Evelyn Mercer." Pleasantries were exchanged, but Caleb could see the way Evelyn swayed slightly on her feet, the way she gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. The woman was dead on her feet, and these society ladies were too busy evaluating her like a prize horse at auction to notice. Floyd, ever the gentleman, despite his rough exterior, noticed. "Ma'am, you look like you could use a good meal. Why don't you sit down and I'll fix you up something hot? Evelyn's expression softened with gratitude. That's very kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose. No imposition at all, Floyd insisted, though I'm afraid we're a bit crowded tonight. Let me see if I can find you a spot. He scanned the room, and that's when his eyes landed on Caleb's table, the only table with an empty chair, the only table with space for another person. Caleb felt something cold settle in his gut, a premonition of change that he couldn't quite name but recognized nonetheless. He watched as Floyd's gaze moved between him and the exhausted schoolteacher, watched the bartender's internal debate play out on his face. Nobody sat at Caleb's table. That was the rule unspoken, but universally understood. But Floyd was a kind man, and this woman clearly needed help. Mr. Rowan, Floyd began, his voice tentative, would you mind if Miss Mercer shared your table just until— That won't be necessary, Evelyn interrupted, and there was something in her voice, pride perhaps, or a fierce independence that refused to be pitied. She'd clearly picked up on the awkward dynamic, the way the entire saloon seemed to hold its breath waiting for Caleb's response. She turned and looked directly at Caleb for the first time, and their eyes met across the crowded room. He saw intelligence there, and wariness, and a bone-deep exhaustion that he recognized because he'd felt it himself every day for the past 8 years. But he also saw something else, a refusal to be broken, a determination to move forward regardless of what had come before. And without warning, without asking permission or waiting for invitation, Evelyn Mercer picked up her bags, walked across the saloon with her head held high, and sat down in the empty chair at Caleb Rowan's table. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ranch hands from the Double R stopped breathing. Mrs. Sullivan's teacup clattered against its saucer. Floyd's jaw dropped open. Caleb stared at her, genuinely shocked for the first time in years. Nobody sat at his table. Nobody dared. Evelyn met his gaze, steadily setting her bags on the floor beside her chair. I apologize for the intrusion, she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. But I've been traveling for 3 days. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, and my feet hurt so badly I'm fairly certain I'll never walk properly again. I saw an empty chair and I took it. If you'd prefer I leave, I will, but I'd appreciate if you'd let me sit here just long enough to catch my breath and order a meal. There was no pleading in her voice, no coquettishness. She was simply stating facts, laying out her situation with the same straightforward honesty one might use in a business negotiation. She wasn't trying to charm him or manipulate him. She was just tired, and she needed to sit down. Caleb found himself in unfamiliar territory. Every instinct he'd cultivated over 8 years of solitude screamed at him to stand up, leave money on the table and walk out. But something, maybe it was the exhaustion in her eyes that mirrored his own. Maybe it was the quiet dignity with which she'd crossed that room. Maybe it was simply that he'd been alone for so damn long made him stay. You can sit, he said, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke more than a few words at a time these days, and even those felt rusty in his throat. Relief flashed across Evelyn's face, though she tried to hide it. Thank you. She removed her hat, revealing hair that had once been carefully styled but now fell in tired waves around her face. Up close he could see the smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. The tension in her shoulders that spoke of someone who'd been on guard for far too long. Floyd appeared at the table, still looking like he'd witnessed a miracle, or possibly the end of the world. Miss Mercer, what can I get you? Whatever's hot and ready, she said. And coffee if you have it. Strong, please. Yes, ma'am. Floyd glanced at Caleb, who'd gone back to his meal, methodically cutting his steak as if nothing unusual had happened. Mr. Rowan, can I get you anything else? No. Floyd hurried away, and the saloon gradually returned to its previous level of noise. Though Caleb could feel the surreptitious glances, could practically hear the gossip being borne at every table. The quiet cowboy had let someone sit with him. Hell had officially frozen over. Evelyn folded her hands on the table and looked around the saloon with open curiosity, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the mounted deer heads, the collection of wanted posters near the door, the painting of a rather buxom woman reclining on a velvet couch that hung behind the bar. She smiled slightly, and it transformed her face, softening those severe features into something approaching genuine beauty. "It's not Philadelphia," she murmured almost to herself. "No," Caleb agreed, surprising himself by responding. "It's not." She turned her attention back to him, and he felt the weight of her gaze, intelligent and assessing. She was studying him the way he'd studied countless outlaws and suspects over his years as a marshal, reading the details, the careful placement of his chair, the way his right hand never strayed far from his gun, the systematic way he'd positioned his utensils, the fact that he'd barely looked at her since she'd sat down. "You're Caleb Rowan," she said. And it wasn't a question. He looked up from his plate, genuinely surprised. "How did you know?" "Mrs. Sullivan mentioned your name when she thought I might need to share your table, and then there was the reaction when I sat down." She paused. "I get the impression I've committed some sort of social transgression." "You sat at my table," Caleb said simply. "Yes. Nobody sits at my table." I gathered that from the stunned silence. She leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him with those sharp hazel eyes. "Why not?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Most people tiptoed around him, avoided personal questions, treated him like he might explode at any moment. But this woman, this exhausted, bedraggled schoolteacher from Philadelphia who just walked into his life like a thunderstorm, simply asked the question as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Because I prefer to eat alone," he said finally. "Fair enough." Floyd arrived with her coffee, and she wrapped her hands around the mug as if it were the most precious thing in the world, breathing in the steam. "I suppose I should have asked permission before sitting, but in my defense I was fairly certain I was going to collapse if I didn't sit down immediately, and your table had an empty chair." "You didn't collapse." "No, but it was a near thing." She took a sip of the coffee and closed her eyes in apparent bliss. "Dear God, that's good. I don't think I've had proper coffee since St. Louis." Despite himself, Caleb felt a flicker of curiosity, the first he'd felt in longer than he could remember. "You came from Philadelphia?" "Yes. Well, Philadelphia to Chicago to St. Louis to Helena, and then that godforsaken stage to here." She opened her eyes and took another sip. "Have you ever ridden a stagecoach through Montana Territory, Mr. Rowan?" "Once or twice." "Then you understand why I'm fairly certain my spine has been permanently rearranged." She set down her cup and looked at him directly. "I appreciate you letting me sit here. I promise I won't disturb your solitude longer than necessary." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no judgment. She was simply acknowledging his preference and respecting it, which somehow made him feel like an ass for having that preference in the first place. Floyd arrived with her meal, the same steak and potatoes Caleb was eating, plus a generous helping of green beans, and Evelyn thanked him with such genuine warmth that the bartender practically blushed. Then she bowed her head briefly, and Caleb realized she was saying grace, a quick, silent prayer, before she picked up her utensils and began to eat. She ate with the same methodical determination she seemed to approach everything else, cutting her meat into small, precise bites, chewing thoroughly, occasionally pausing to sip her coffee. She didn't try to make conversation, didn't attempt to fill the silence with nervous chatter. She simply ate, and Caleb found himself grateful for it. The saloon continued to buzz around them. The ranch hands from the Double R had resumed their celebration, their voices growing louder with each round of drinks. Mrs. Sullivan and her companions had their heads together, undoubtedly dissecting every detail of the new school teacher's arrival and her shocking decision to sit with the town recluse. Doc Pritchard had moved on from politics to medicine, regaling Samuel Chen with a story about a particularly difficult childbirth he'd attended last spring. And at the corner table, in a bubble of quiet that seemed to exist separate from the rest of the room, two strangers sat across from each other and ate their meals in companionable silence. It was Evelyn who finally broke it, setting down her fork with a soft clink against the plate. "Mr. Rowan, can I ask you a question?" Caleb looked up warily. "Depends on the question. Is there a particular reason everyone in this town seems terrified of you, or are you simply that good at cultivating an air of menace?" The bluntness of it startled a sound out of him, not quite a laugh, but close enough that it shocked him almost as much as it would have shocked anyone who knew him. When was the last time he'd laughed? When was the last time anyone had been brave enough or foolish enough to speak to him that way? Little of both, he admitted. She smiled, and again he was struck by how it changed her face. I thought so. You have excellent posture, by the way. Very intimidating. I imagine you practiced it. Comes with the badge. Ah! She picked up her coffee cup. So you were a lawman. That explains the gun and the strategic seating arrangement. Deputy Marshal, I don't wear the badge anymore. But you still sit with your back to the wall and your gun hand free. It wasn't a question. Old habits. Something like that. She nodded as if that made perfect sense, which perhaps it did. She took another sip of coffee, and he noticed the way her shoulders had finally started to relax, the way some of the tension had drained from her face now that she had hot food in her stomach and a chair beneath her. Why Bramble Creek? Caleb asked, surprising himself again. He didn't ask personal questions. He didn't engage in conversation. And yet here he was asking this stranger about her life as if he had any right to know. Evelyn set down her cup and met his gaze, and for a moment he saw something flicker behind her eyes, pain maybe, or fear, or both. But it passed quickly, replaced by that same determined resolve he'd noticed when she first walked into the saloon. Because it's about as far from Philadelphia as I could get while still remaining in civilized territory, she said simply. And because they needed a teacher, and I needed a fresh start. There was a story there, a weight of history in those carefully chosen words. Caleb recognized it because he carried the same weight himself, the burden of a past that couldn't be outrun but could perhaps be escaped at least temporarily, at least enough to breathe. Philadelphia's loss, he said quietly. She looked at him sharply, as if trying to determine whether he was mocking her. But whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy her because she smiled again, smaller this time, but somehow more genuine. That's kind of you to say, Mr. Rowan. Caleb, her eyebrows rose slightly. Caleb, then. And I'm Evelyn, though I suppose in my professional capacity I'll need to be Miss Mercer. Evelyn suits you better. Does it? She tilted her head, studying him. Why? He wasn't entirely sure himself. Maybe it was because Miss Mercer sounded formal and distant, like the title was a wall between her and the rest of the world. But Evelyn felt real honest, like the woman who'd sat down at his table without asking permission. Just does, he said finally. They fell into silence again, but it was different this time, less wary, more comfortable. Evelyn finished her meal and her coffee, and Caleb noticed that she'd cleaned her plate completely, not leaving even a scrap behind. She'd been hungrier than she'd let on, probably hungrier than she'd even admitted to herself. Floyd approached the table cautiously, as if afraid any sudden movement might break whatever strange spell had fallen over his most reclusive customer. Miss Mercer, can I get you anything else? Pie, maybe Ida makes a fine apple pie. Evelyn's eyes lit up with genuine interest. That sounds wonderful, but I'm afraid I've already imposed on Mr. Rowan's hospitality quite enough for one evening. You haven't imposed, Caleb heard himself say. And Floyd's right. Ida's apple pie is worth the price of admission. Floyd's jaw nearly hit the floor. In 8 years, he'd never heard Caleb Rowan recommend anything or engage in what might be considered friendly conversation. The world had definitely turned upside down. Well, in that case, Evelyn said, her smile growing wider, I'd love a piece of pie, and perhaps another cup of that excellent coffee. Coming right up, Floyd said, hurrying away before Caleb could change his mind or reality could reassert itself. Mrs. Sullivan and her companions had given up all pretense of their own conversation and were now openly staring at Caleb and Evelyn's table. The ranch hands from the Double R were placing bets on whether the quiet cowboy would actually continue sitting with the pretty schoolteacher or would bolt for the door at any moment. Doc Pritchard had paused mid-sentence to watch his bourbon forgotten, but Caleb barely noticed any of it. His attention had narrowed to the woman sitting across from him. This stranger who'd walked into his carefully constructed solitude and somehow made it seem less like safety and more like a prison. You'll like Bramble Creek, he said, the words coming easier now. It's a good town, good people mostly. I'm glad to hear it. Evelyn smoothed her napkin on her lap. I'll confess I was nervous about coming here. Montana Territory isn't exactly known for its refinement. We've got our rough edges, Caleb admitted, but folks here look after their own. You teach their children well, treat them with respect, and they'll move mountains for you. That's comforting to know, she paused. What about you, Caleb? Do you have children who will be attending my school? No. The word came out harder than he'd intended, and he saw her notice it, saw the quick flash of understanding in her eyes. She'd touched on something painful, though she couldn't have known it. I see. Floyd returned with the pie and more coffee, setting them down with exaggerated care, as if afraid any noise might disturb whatever miracle was occurring at the corner table. Evelyn thanked him warmly and took a bite of the pie, closing her eyes in obvious appreciation. Oh, that's divine. Please tell Ida she's an artist. I'll do that, Floyd said, grinning like a proud parent. When he'd gone, Evelyn looked at Caleb thoughtfully. I have a feeling, she said slowly, that you and I are not so different, Mr. Rowan Caleb, I mean. How do you figure we're both running from something? She said it matter-of-factly without drama or self-pity. You ran to a corner table in a saloon where nobody bothers you. I ran to a teaching position in the middle of Montana territory. Different methods, same goal, to be left alone with our ghosts. The accuracy of her assessment should have bothered him, should have made him angry or defensive. Instead, he found himself nodding slowly. Maybe so. The difference is, she continued, taking another bite of pie, I'm hoping to find a way to live with my ghosts instead of just hiding from them. I don't know if that's possible, but I'd like to try. And if it's not possible, she met his gaze steadily, then at least I'll have tried. At least I'll know. There was a courage in that Caleb realized, a bravery he'd lost somewhere along the way, buried under 8 years of guilt and self-imposed isolation. This woman who'd been traveling for days, who was clearly running from something painful in her past, who had every reason to be bitter and broken, had instead chosen hope, had chosen to try. It shamed him a little, and it intrigued him more than anything had in years. What happened in Philadelphia? He asked quietly. Evelyn's smile faded, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, thought he'd overstepped the fragile boundaries of whatever strange connection had formed between them. But then she set down her fork and folded her hands on the table, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the pain he could see in her eyes. I was engaged to be married, she said, to a man named James Whitmore, whose father owns half of Philadelphia and most of the politicians along with it. 3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered James had been inappropriate with one of his family's young housemaids, a girl of 16. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. Inappropriate. That's the polite term for it, yes. Her voice remained calm, but her knuckles had gone white where her hands were clasped. I confronted him. He laughed, said I was being dramatic, that it was nothing, that all men had their diversions. When I threatened to break the engagement and tell people why, he became less amused. What did he do? He had his father spread rumors that I'd been having an affair with their stable hand, that I was trying to cover my own indiscretion by making false accusations against James. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. In Philadelphia society, a woman's reputation is everything. Within a week, I was completely ruined. No one would receive me. My own family was ashamed. The school where I'd been teaching dismissed me. I had 2 choices: stay and be destroyed completely, or leave and start over somewhere no one knew my name. So you came here. So I came here. She picked up her coffee cup, wrapping both hands around it as if drawing strength from its warmth. I don't expect you to believe me. I know how the story sounds, a scorned woman making accusations against a powerful man, but I'm telling you the truth. I believe you, Caleb said, and he did. He'd spent years reading people, learning to see past lies and deception. Whatever else Evelyn Mercer might be, she wasn't a liar. She looked at him in surprise. Just like that. Just like that. He pushed his own coffee cup aside and leaned forward slightly. Men like that, men who abuse their power, who hurt people weaker than themselves, I've met them before. Hell, I've arrested them before. They think they're untouchable, and usually they're right. James is certainly untouchable, at least in Philadelphia. But not here. Caleb gestured around the saloon. Here, nobody gives a damn about Philadelphia society or whose father owns what. Here, you're just the new school teacher, and you'll be judged on what you do, not on what some rich bastard said about you." For the first time since she'd started telling her story, real hope flickered across Evelyn's face. "You think so?" "I know so. This town's seen its share of people running from their pasts. Hell, half the territory is made up of folks looking for a fresh start. You do right by the children, you'll be fine." She was quiet for a moment, studying her coffee. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. "Thank you, Caleb. You didn't have to tell me that, but I'm grateful you did. You were honest with me. Figured I owed you the same. Are you going to tell me your story now?" She asked it gently without pressure, as if she'd understand if he said no. And that perversely made him want to tell her. Not everything he wasn't sure he could put into words, what had happened that day in Helena, the screams and the gunfire and the sight of that young woman falling because his bullet had gone through the outlaw's shoulder and into her chest, but enough. Enough so she'd understand why he sat alone, why he preferred his own company, why the thought of letting someone in filled him with a fear he couldn't quite name. But before he could speak, the saloon door burst open, and a young man stumbled in, his face flushed and his breathing labored. Doc Pritchard. "We need you at the Hendersons' place. Sarah's time has come, and something's wrong." Doc Pritchard was on his feet immediately, all traces of bourbon-induced mellowness vanishing in an instant. "What kind of wrong, Billy?" "She's bleeding bad, Doc, real bad. Pa sent me to fetch you quick as I could." "Right." Doc grabbed his medical bag from where it sat perpetually ready near the bar. "Floyd, I'll need someone to drive me. My hands aren't steady enough tonight." Floyd looked torn. He couldn't leave the bar, not with the saloon this crowded. Samuel Chen stepped forward. "I'll take you, Doc." "Bless you, Samuel." Doc was already heading for the door, Billy at his heels. Then he paused and looked back at the saloon, his eyes landing on Evelyn. "Miss Mercer, you wouldn't happen to have any experience with birthing, would you?" Evelyn stood immediately. "Some. I've assisted at 3 births back in Philadelphia. If you need another pair of hands, I'll take all the help I can get." Doc was already moving. "Caleb, you got your wagon." Caleb was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move, old instincts kicking in. In an emergency, everyone helped. That was the way of things out here. "Yeah, it's faster than Chen's buggy." "Then let's move." The next few minutes were a blur of motion. Caleb left money on the table, grabbed his hat, and was out the door with Evelyn right behind him. She'd snatched up her bags, but Floyd called out that he'd keep them safe behind the bar. Doc and Billy were already in the back of Caleb's wagon, and Evelyn climbed up beside them, while Caleb swung into the driver's seat and took up the reins. "How far?" he asked Billy. 3 miles west up toward Copper Ridge." Caleb knew the place. He snapped the reins, and his horse's good strong animals he'd trained himself leaped forward into the darkness. The cold November wind whipped past them as they raced through the night, the wagon bouncing over the rough road. Evelyn gripping the side rail to keep from being thrown off. "Doc," she called over the wind and the thunder of hooves, "what should I be prepared for?" "Breech birth, most likely," Doc called back. "Or the cords wrapped around the baby's neck. Sarah's a small woman, and this is her first child. I've been worried about this since I examined her last month." They made it to the Henderson farmhouse in record time, Caleb pushing his horses harder than he probably should have. The house was lit up like Christmas, and he could hear a woman's screams from inside, raw and terrified. He pulled the wagon to a stop, and everyone piled out, Doc leading the way with Evelyn right behind him. Caleb stood by his wagon, uncertain. This wasn't his place. He'd driven them here, but the rest was Doc's domain. He should probably head back to town, let them handle it. But then Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Caleb, Doc needs more hot water and their well's dry. Is there a creek nearby?" "half-mile south." "Can you fetch it?" "We need at least 4 buckets, and we need it fast." He nodded and grabbed the buckets from the Hendersons' porch, then climbed back into his wagon and headed for the creek. It took him 20 minutes to make the round trip, and when he returned with the water, he could still hear Sarah Henderson's screams, though they sounded weaker now, more desperate. He carried the buckets inside into a small, cramped cabin that smelled of blood and fear and the particular terror that comes when life and death hang in the balance. Sarah Henderson lay on the bed, her face white as paper, her nightgown soaked with sweat and blood. Her husband Tom stood in the corner looking like he might pass out, while Doc worked between Sarah's legs with practiced efficiency. And Evelyn. Evelyn stood beside the bed, holding Sarah's hand, her face calm, despite the horror of what she was witnessing, speaking in a low, steady voice. "You're doing wonderfully, Sarah. Just a little longer now. The baby's almost here. Can you feel it? Your baby's almost here." "I can't," Sarah sobbed. "I can't do it. I'm dying. I'm dying." "You're not dying." Evelyn's voice was firm but gentle, the voice of someone who'd faced fear before and won. "You're giving birth, and yes, it hurts like the devil himself is trying to tear you apart, but you can do this. You're stronger than you think." "Listen to her, Sarah," Doc said, not looking up from his work. "She's right. One more push. Give me one more good push." Sarah screamed a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night. And then there was another sound, a thin, wavering cry that slowly grew stronger, more insistent. A baby's cry. "It's a girl," Doc announced, holding up a tiny, blood-covered creature who was howling her displeasure at being dragged into the cold world. A perfect baby girl. Tom Henderson's legs gave out and he sank to his knees, weeping. Sarah started laughing and crying at the same time, reaching for her daughter with trembling hands. And Evelyn, her borrowed nightgown splattered with blood, her hair falling down around her shoulders, smiled with such pure joy that it transformed her exhausted face into something almost radiant. Doc handed the baby to Sarah and went back to his work delivering the afterbirth and tending to Sarah's bleeding. "Miss Mercer, if you could clean the baby while I finish up here." "Of course." Evelyn took the squirming infant with practiced ease and carried her to the basin Caleb had filled with warm water. She worked quickly and efficiently, washing away the blood and vernix, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket, checking her over with the thoroughness of someone who'd done this before. Caleb watched from the doorway, unable to look away. There was something compelling about the scene, the new mother and father weeping with relief, the doctor working to ensure Sarah's safety, and the schoolteacher from Philadelphia gently cleaning a newborn baby as if she'd been born to do nothing else. It was life raw and messy and beautiful, and it made his chest ache with something he couldn't quite name. An hour later, Sarah was resting comfortably, her daughter nursing at her breast, and Doc had pronounced both mother and baby healthy and strong. Tom Henderson kept trying to thank them, his voice breaking, offering to pay them anything, everything. Doc waved him off. "You pay me in chickens like you always do, Tom. That's payment enough." "But Miss Mercer, she saved Sarah, Doc. I saw it. When Sarah wanted to give up, Miss Mercer wouldn't let her." Evelyn, who'd been washing her hands in a basin, looked up in surprise. "I didn't do anything special, Mr. Henderson. I just held her hand." "You did more than that," Sarah said softly from the bed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but filled with warmth. "You made me believe I could do it. Thank you." Evelyn smiled and Caleb saw her blink back tears. "It was my honor, Mrs. Henderson. Congratulations on your beautiful daughter." They left the Henderson family to their joy and exhaustion, climbing back into Caleb's wagon for the ride back to town. It was well past midnight now, the stars brilliant overhead, the temperature dropping toward freezing. Doc dozed in the back, worn out from the evening's excitement. Evelyn sat beside Caleb on the driver's bench, wrapped in a blanket. Tom had insisted she take her borrowed clothes, one of Sarah's nightgowns barely visible beneath. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice quiet in the darkness. "Thank you for driving us, and for getting the water. Nothing to thank me for." "Yes, there is." She turned to look at him, her face barely visible in the starlight. "You could have left after dropping us off. Most men would have. But you stayed, and you helped, and—" She trailed off, then said simply, "Thank you." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They continued on through the night, and he found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, the warmth of her despite the cold, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the way she'd pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders. When they reached town, he pulled up in front of the Silver Spur, where Mrs. Sullivan was waiting with several other ladies, having been alerted by the Hendersons' young son, Billy, who'd ridden ahead. They descended on Evelyn with clucks of concern and approval, whisking her away to the teacherage, with promises of hot water for a bath and fresh clothes and a proper bed. But before she disappeared into the protective custody of Bramble Creek's womenfolk, Evelyn turned back and caught Caleb's eye. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, and there was something in her voice, a question beneath the question, a hope that he might say yes. Caleb knew what she was really asking. Would he let her sit at his table again? Would he allow this fragile connection to continue, or would he retreat back into his carefully constructed solitude? 8 years of habit screamed at him to say no, to reclaim his corner table and his isolation. But something else, something he'd thought long dead, whispered a different answer. "Same time tomorrow," he heard himself say. Evelyn smiled, and even exhausted and covered in someone else's blood, and wearing a borrowed nightgown, she was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in 8 long years. Then she was gone, swept away by Mrs. Sullivan and her flock, and Caleb was left alone in his wagon with a sleeping Doc Pritchard and a growing certainty that his life, his carefully ordered, safely solitary life, had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to understand. He drove Doc home, then headed back to his ranch, the wagon rattling through the darkness. But when he reached his cabin and finally lay down in his bed, he found he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing her face, the determination when she'd walked into the saloon, the calm strength as she'd held Sarah Henderson's hand, the pure joy when she'd cleaned that newborn baby. And he kept hearing her words, "We're both running from something. The difference is I'm hoping to find a way to live with my ghosts instead of just hiding from them." For 8 years, Caleb Rowan had been hiding. For 8 years, he'd convinced himself that isolation was safety, that keeping people at a distance meant keeping the pain at bay. But now, lying in his empty cabin with the memory of a stranger's smile playing through his mind, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. Maybe there was another way to live with the past. Maybe he didn't have to eat alone forever. The thought terrified him almost as much as it intrigued him. Outside, the Montana night stretched endlessly cold and dark and full of stars. And somewhere in town, in the little teacherage beside the schoolhouse, Evelyn Mercer was probably sleeping exhausted from her journey and the unexpected drama of her first night in Bramble Creek. Neither of them knew it yet, but that single evening, the night she sat down without asking, the night they rode through darkness to help a woman give birth, the night they made a promise to meet again, would change everything. For both of them, the careful walls they'd built around their hearts had just developed their first cracks. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Montana mountains, turning the frost-covered meadows to gold, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning sun painted Bramble Creek in shades of amber and gold, but Caleb had been awake long before dawn broke. He'd spent most of the night staring at his cabin ceiling, replaying the previous evening in his mind like a man possessed. The way Evelyn had walked into that saloon, the way she'd sat down without permission, the way she'd held Sarah Henderson's hand and refused to let her give up. By the time gray light filtered through his windows, he'd made coffee 3 times and barely touched any of it. He told himself he was being ridiculous. She was just a woman, just the new school teacher, just someone passing through his life, who'd shared a meal and happened to be there when Doc needed help. There was no reason for his heart to be hammering against his ribs as he shaved with more care than usual. No reason to change his shirt twice before settling on the blue one that Ida had once told him brought out his eyes. No reason to feel like a green kid heading to his first dance. But as he rode into town that evening, the sun already beginning its descent toward the mountains, he couldn't deny the nervous energy thrumming through his veins. Would she actually be there? Had her invitation been genuine or just politeness born of exhaustion? Maybe she'd already heard the stories about him. The whispers about why a deputy marshal had turned in his badge and decided that sharing a table with Bramble Creek's resident ghost was more trouble than it was worth. The silver spur looked the same as it always did, weathered wooden walls, the hand-painted sign creaking in the evening breeze, golden lamplight spilling from the windows. But when Caleb pushed through the door, everything felt different. Floyd looked up from behind the bar and grinned like the cat who'd caught the canary. Mrs. Sullivan and her companions occupied their usual table, their conversation stopping dead the moment he entered. The ranch hands from the miller spread paused mid-poker hand to watch. And there at his corner table, his table, the one where he'd eaten alone for 8 years, sat Evelyn Mercer. She'd cleaned up considerably since last night. Her honey-brown hair was pinned up properly now, though a few rebellious strands escaped to curl against her neck. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, practical and modest, but well made, with a white collar that made her hazel eyes seem even more striking. She was reading a book, her posture perfect, completely at ease, despite the attention she was receiving from every person in the saloon. When Caleb approached, she looked up and smiled, and he felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of something that had been wound tight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. "Right on time," she said, closing her book and setting it aside. "I was beginning to worry you'd changed your mind." "I don't change my mind often." He sat down across from her, hyper-aware that the entire saloon was watching this interaction like it was the most fascinating theater production they'd ever witnessed. "How are you feeling after last night?" "Exhausted in the most wonderful way." Her eyes lit up with the memory. "I stopped by to see Sarah and the baby this morning. They're both doing beautifully. They've named her Hope Catherine Henderson." "That's a good name." "I thought so too." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Tom Henderson tried to give me $20. I refused, of course, but he was quite insistent. Finally, Mrs. Sullivan intervened and suggested he donate it to the school instead. Apparently we need new textbooks rather desperately." "That sounds like Margaret." Caleb accepted the whiskey Floyd brought over without being asked, along with a knowing wink that made him want to sink through the floor. "She's got a good heart under all that propriety. She's been very kind to me. They all have." Evelyn paused as Floyd took her order, the same meal as last night with coffee instead of the pie. "I'll confess I was worried about how I'd be received. A stranger from the East with no references beyond a letter from the Territorial Education Board. But everyone's been welcoming isn't quite strong enough. They've been wonderful. I told you they would be. You treat their children right, they'll move mountains for you." "You were correct." She studied him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "Though I have to say the person I'm most surprised by is you." "How so?" "You're here. You came back." She said it simply, but there was weight behind the words. "When I invited you last night, I wasn't entirely certain you would. In fact, I'd say I was about 60% convinced you'd reclaim your solitary table and pretend our conversation never happened." Caleb found himself almost smiling. "Only 60%. I'm an optimist. It's gotten me into trouble before." Her expression turned more serious. "But I'm glad you came, Caleb. I meant what I said. I think we understand each other in ways most people wouldn't." Before he could respond, Floyd arrived with her meal, and the conversation paused while she said her quiet grace and began to eat. Caleb watched her surreptitiously, noting the way she cut her food into precise bites, the way she sat with impeccable posture despite the long day she must have had, the way she occasionally glanced around the saloon as if cataloging every detail for future reference. "How was your first day at the school?" he asked. Evelyn's face transformed with genuine enthusiasm. "Challenging and delightful in equal measure. I have 18 students ranging from 6 years old to 14. The older boys in the back tried to test me, of course, putting a toad in my desk drawer, that sort of thing. I thanked them for providing such an excellent specimen for our natural science lesson and made them spend an hour drawing detailed diagrams of amphibian anatomy." Despite himself, Caleb laughed an actual laugh, not just a rough exhalation, but a real sound of amusement. It felt rusty, unpracticed, like a muscle he'd forgotten he had. Bet they didn't expect that. The look on Billy Thompson's face was priceless. She smiled. Then her expression grew more thoughtful. "But they're good children, Caleb. Smart, curious, eager to learn, even when they're pretending not to be. The school building itself needs work. The roof leaks in 2 places, half the windows don't close properly. And I'm fairly certain there's a family of mice living in the supply closet, but it's nothing that can't be fixed." "I could take a look at the roof," Caleb heard himself offer. "If you want." Evelyn set down her fork, her eyes widening slightly. "You do that. Know my way around a hammer and nails. Wouldn't take more than a day or 2 to patch the leaks and replace any damaged shingles." He felt heat creeping up the back of his neck. Why the hell had he offered? He didn't get involved in town business. He didn't volunteer for projects. He didn't. That would be incredibly helpful. Evelyn said, her voice warm with gratitude. The children and I would appreciate it enormously, though I insist on compensating you for your time and materials. Don't need compensation. Caleb, consider it a welcome to Bramble Creek, or payment for letting me share your company. The words came out before he could stop them, more honest than he'd intended. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, something indefinable passing across her face. Then she smiled soft and genuine. In that case, I accept. Thank you. They fell into an easy conversation after that, trading stories about their respective days. Evelyn described her students with affection and humor. Young Emma Pritchard, who could already read at a 6th grade level despite being only 8, the Martinez twins who spoke more Spanish than English, but were learning fast Sarah Chen's boy who had a gift for mathematics that reminded her of students she'd taught at prestigious academies back east. Caleb in turn found himself talking about his ranch, about the mare who'd just foaled, and the ornery bull he was considering selling because the damn animal had destroyed 3 fences in the past month. It was normal conversation, the kind of easy back and forth that people who actually knew each other might share. And yet it felt revolutionary to Caleb, who hadn't engaged in genuine conversation with another human being in longer than he cared to remember. Around them, the saloon continued its evening rhythm. The poker game in the corner grew more heated, with accusations of cheating flying back and forth in good-natured tones. Mrs. Sullivan and her companions eventually stopped pretending not to watch Caleb and Evelyn's table, simply accepting that miracles apparently did happen, and the town recluse had found a friend. Doc Pritchard stumbled in around 7 looking for dinner and immediately launching into a detailed account of little Hope Henderson's excellent lung capacity and her mother's remarkable recovery. "Miss Mercer," he said, approaching their table with the easy familiarity of a man who'd had just enough bourbon to forget about propriety. "I wanted to thank you again for your assistance last night. You've got steady hands and a calm head, 2 things worth their weight in gold when delivering babies." "I'm just glad I could help, Doctor." "Call me Doc. Everyone does." He swayed slightly, and Caleb stood steadying the older man with a hand on his elbow. "You know, Caleb, you did good work too. Fastest I've ever gotten to Copper Ridge. Probably saved Sarah's life with that driving." Just happened to have my wagon. Happened to my foot." Doc patted Caleb's shoulder with drunken affection. "You're a good man, even if you try to hide it. Always have been." He turned his attention back to Evelyn. "You keep sitting with this one, Miss Mercer. He needs it more than he knows." Then Doc wandered off toward the bar, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. Evelyn tactfully didn't comment on Doc's observation, simply took another sip of her coffee. But Caleb could see the questions in her eyes, the curiosity she was too polite to voice. "He's right, you know," Caleb said quietly, surprising himself again. "I do need it. The company, I mean. Didn't realize how much until—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Until I sat down without asking," Evelyn supplied gently. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in slow circles on the table. "Can I tell you something? I was terrified when I walked in here last night. Absolutely petrified. New town, new job, exhausted beyond measure, and walking into a saloon full of strangers who were all staring at me like I'd grown a second head." "You didn't look scared." "Good. I've had a lot of practice pretending to be brave when I'm not." She met his gaze directly. "But when I sat down at your table and you didn't immediately throw me out when you let me stay, despite clearly not wanting company, that small kindness meant more than you know. It made me think that maybe, just maybe, I could survive out here, that maybe I wasn't completely alone." The rawness in her voice, the vulnerability she was offering him, made Caleb's chest tighten. He understood that feeling, the desperate need to connect with another human being while simultaneously being terrified of what that connection might cost. He'd spent 8 years choosing fear over connection, safety over risk. And this woman who'd lost everything and traveled halfway across the country to start over was choosing the opposite. She was choosing to be brave. "You're not alone," he said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "You've got a whole town that's already half in love with you students who need you, families like the Hendersons who'll be grateful to you for the rest of their lives. You're going to do just fine here, Evelyn. And do I have you—" The question was barely above a whisper, her hazel eyes searching his face. "Can I count you among those who might become friends?" Every instinct Caleb had cultivated over 8 years of solitude screamed at him to say no, to pull back, to protect himself from the inevitable pain that came with caring about another person. But when he opened his mouth, Different words emerged, words he hadn't planned, words that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Yeah, he said. You can count me. Evelyn's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm and bright and full of promise. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, just for a moment, a brief touch that sent electricity racing up his arm. Thank you, Caleb. That means more than I can say. The evening continued, conversation flowing more easily now that they'd crossed some invisible threshold. Evelyn told him about Philadelphia, about the city she'd loved and lost, about her family, who'd chosen reputation over their daughter, about the books she'd read and the dreams she'd had as a girl. Caleb, in turn, found himself sharing pieces of his own past, growing up in Kansas, learning to handle a gun from his father, joining the Marshal Service at 22 because he'd wanted to make a difference, to be one of the good guys. He didn't tell her about Helena yet, about the day everything had fallen apart. That wound was still too raw, too painful to expose even to someone who might understand. But he sensed she knew there was more to his story, just as he knew there was more to hers, depths of pain and shame and guilt that couldn't be conveyed in a single conversation. They had time, though. That was the surprising realization that settled over Caleb as the evening wore on. They had time to share their stories, to peel back the layers of protection they'd both built around their hearts. There was no rush, no pressure. Just two wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. It was past 9 when Evelyn finally glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed reluctantly. I should go. School starts at 8, and I still have lessons to prepare for tomorrow. I'll walk you home. Caleb stood before he'd consciously made the decision, ignoring the knowing looks from Floyd and Mrs. Sullivan and half the damn saloon. That's not necessary. The teacherage is only 2 streets over. It's dark and you're new to town. I'll walk you home. He said it in a tone that brooked no argument, and after a moment Evelyn nodded, gathering her book and her small reticule. They stepped out into the November night, and Caleb was struck by the cold after the warmth of the saloon. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and without thinking, Caleb shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him in surprise. Caleb, you'll freeze. I'm fine. Montana born and raised, this is nothing. Stubborn man, she murmured, but she pulled his coat closer and he tried not to notice how good it looked on her, how right it felt to see her wrapped in something of his. They walked in comfortable silence through the quiet streets of Bramble Creek. Most of the town had already settled in for the night lamplight glowing in windows, the occasional dog barking in the distance. The sky overhead was brilliant, with stars so many and so bright that it seemed impossible they were real. I'd forgotten, Evelyn said softly, tilting her head back to look at the heavens. In Philadelphia, you can barely see the stars. Too many streetlights, too much smoke from the factories. But here, it's like someone threw diamonds across black velvet. Wait until winter really sets in. On clear nights, when it's cold enough, the sky does things that don't seem possible. Northern Lights colors you can't describe dancing across the darkness. Like, hell, I don't know. Like God's putting on a show just because he can. I'd like to see that. She glanced at him, her face barely visible in the starlight. Would you show me when the Northern Lights come? It was such a simple request, and yet it implied a future, implied that they'd still be doing this, still sharing meals and conversations and moments weeks or months from now when deep winter arrived. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with something that felt almost like hope. Yeah, he said. I'll show you. They reached the teacherage, a small but tidy cottage beside the schoolhouse, its white paint gleaming in the moonlight. Evelyn paused at the gate, reluctant to go inside despite the cold. She removed Caleb's coat and handed it back to him, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Thank you for walking me home, and for agreeing to fix the school roof, and for... She trailed off, then finished simply, for everything. Same time tomorrow. I'll be there. She hesitated, then added, unless you'd prefer to reclaim your solitary table, I don't want to impose on your privacy every evening. You're not imposing. The words came easier now, more natural. I like your company, Evelyn. Haven't liked anyone's company in a long time, but I like yours. Her smile was visible even in the darkness. I like yours too, Caleb Rowan, very much. She slipped through the gate and up the path to her door, turning once to wave before disappearing inside. Caleb stood there longer than he should have, staring at the cottage like a fool before finally turning and heading back toward where he'd left his horse outside the saloon. Floyd was sweeping the floor when Caleb returned to collect his things. The bartender looked up with a knowing grin. "So, Miss Mercer seems nice." "She is. Pretty, too." "Floyd, I'm just saying it's good to see you talking to someone. Been worried about you, Caleb. All these years sitting alone, never letting anyone close. Ain't healthy for a man." Caleb paused in the doorway, looking back at his friend. "I know you mean well, but nothing." Floyd's expression turned serious. "Whatever happened in Helena, whatever you're carrying around like a millstone on your back, it's been 8 years. 8 years of punishing yourself, of cutting yourself off from everyone who might care about you. Miss Mercer seems like a good woman, and more importantly, she seems like someone who understands what it's like to hurt. Don't push her away just because you're scared of feeling something again." The accuracy of Floyd's words hit Caleb like a physical blow. "I'm not." "You are. I've known you since you first came to Bramble Creek. Remember, I've watched you build those walls brick by brick, shutting out the world because you think you don't deserve to be part of it anymore. But you do deserve it, Caleb. You deserve friendship and companionship, and maybe even more than that if you're brave enough to reach for it." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded once and headed out into the night. But Floyd's words echoed in his mind during the long ride back to his ranch, accompanied by the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. Was that what he'd been doing? Punishing himself? He told himself it was about keeping others safe, about ensuring his mistakes never hurt anyone again. But maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he'd just been too scared to risk his heart, too afraid of the pain that came with caring. And now this woman, this brave, broken, beautiful woman from Philadelphia, had walked into his life and challenged everything he'd convinced himself was true. The following days fell into a pattern that felt both comfortable and dangerous. Every evening, Caleb would arrive at the Silver Spur to find Evelyn already seated at their table, and yes, he'd started thinking of it as their table, which was both terrifying and oddly thrilling. They'd share a meal, trade stories about their days, and then he'd walk her home through the darkening streets, their conversations stretching longer each night as they both became reluctant to say goodbye. On Saturday, Caleb showed up at the schoolhouse with his tools and materials to repair the roof. He'd expected to work alone, but Evelyn insisted on helping, climbing up the ladder in a borrowed pair of men's overalls that she'd somehow made look almost elegant. She proved surprisingly adept with a hammer, and they worked side by side under the autumn sun, replacing damaged shingles and patching leaks, while Evelyn told him stories about her students. "Emma Pritchard is reading Dickens," she said, handing him another nail. "Can you imagine she's 8 years old and reading David Copperfield for pleasure? Her parents have no idea where she gets it from. Neither of them made it past 4th grade. Doc's wife was a teacher before she married him," Caleb said, fitting a shingle into place. "Probably where Emma gets her love of books." "That makes sense. I've been thinking about starting an advanced reading group for the older students, maybe meeting once a week after regular school hours. There's so much potential in these children, Caleb. If we can nurture it, encourage it. You care about them." It wasn't a question. "Of course I care about them. They're my students, my responsibility." She paused in her work, looking out over the town spread below them. "Besides, they gave me a chance when I needed one most. The least I can do is give them my best in return." They worked in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds, the tap of hammers, and the distant sounds of the town going about its Saturday business. Down below, people passed by on their errands, and Caleb couldn't help but notice how many of them paused to watch. How many conversations stopped mid-sentence as townspeople took in the sight of the reclusive rancher and the new schoolteacher working together on the school roof. Let them talk, he thought. Let them speculate and gossip and draw their conclusions. For the first time in 8 years, he didn't care what people thought. By late afternoon, the roof was finished solid and weatherproof. Caleb was gathering his tools when Evelyn disappeared into the schoolhouse and emerged with a basket. "I made lunch," she announced. "Well, Mrs. Sullivan made lunch and I helped. Either way, we have fried chicken biscuits and apple pie, and I refuse to let you leave without eating." They sat on the steps of the schoolhouse, the basket between them, and shared the meal while the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains. The chicken was perfectly seasoned, the biscuits light and fluffy, the pie sweet and tart in equal measure. But what Caleb would remember later wasn't the food, it was the easy laughter, the way Evelyn's eyes crinkled when she smiled, the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said after they'd finished eating, her tone growing more serious. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "Fair enough." She drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "The Marshal Service, why did you leave? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but I've been wondering, you seem like someone who was born to wear a badge." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. He'd known this question was coming, eventually had been preparing for it since that first night, but preparing didn't make it easier. "I killed an innocent woman," he said finally, the words coming out flat and emotionless because that was the only way he could say them. "Her name was Rebecca Morrison. She was 23 years old, engaged to be married, and I shot her during a botched arrest in Helena." Evelyn didn't gasp or recoil. She simply waited, her presence steady and calm beside him. "We'd been tracking this outlaw Cole Garrett for 6 months. Caleb continued, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. "He was wanted for bank robbery, murder, all sorts of hell. We finally cornered him in a boarding house in Helena. Marshal Blackwood and I went in to make the arrest. Garrett grabbed Rebecca, used her as a shield. He had a gun to her head, was threatening to kill her if we didn't let him go. His hands clenched into fist nails, digging into his palms. I had a clear shot. Or I thought I did. I was always a good shot, Evelyn. Best in the Marshal Service. I could hit a target from 100 yards without breaking a sweat. So when Garrett shifted slightly when I saw that window of opportunity, I took it. But something went wrong, so," Evelyn said softly. "Rebecca moved. Just a fraction of an inch, just enough. My bullet went through Garrett's shoulder, not enough to stop him, and into her chest. She died in my arms while Garrett got away." He finally looked at Evelyn, needing her to understand. "I killed an innocent woman because I was too confident, too sure of myself, because I thought I could make the shot. And Garrett, we caught him 3 days later. He hung for his crimes. But that didn't bring Rebecca back, didn't undo what I'd done." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. "I turned in my badge the day after her funeral, came out here to Bramble Creek, bought some land, built a cabin. Figured if I stayed away from people, I couldn't hurt anyone else." Evelyn was silent for a long moment, processing his confession. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "It wasn't your fault, Caleb. I pulled the trigger. Garrett pulled the trigger on Rebecca Morrison's fate the moment he grabbed her. You were trying to save her life. The fact that you failed doesn't make you a murderer, it makes you human. Tell that to her family. Tell that to the man she was supposed to marry. I'm sure they're angry, they have every right to be, but Caleb..." She shifted closer, her hand finding his on the step between them. "You can't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for one mistake made in an impossible situation. Rebecca Morrison wouldn't want that. Her family wouldn't want that. And I don't think you want it either. Not really." Her hand was warm over his, small but strong, and Caleb found himself turning his palm up, lacing his fingers through hers. It was the first time he'd voluntarily touched another person, really touched them in 8 years, and it felt both terrifying and right. "How do you do it?" he asked quietly. "How do you carry what happened to you in Philadelphia without letting it destroy you?" "Who says it hasn't destroyed me?" Evelyn's laugh was bitter. "I lost everything, Caleb. My reputation, my family, my home, my entire future. Everything I thought I was, everything I'd worked for, gone, because I dared to tell the truth about a powerful man. Some days I wake up so angry I can barely breathe. Other days I'm so sad I can't seem to find a reason to get out of bed." "But you do. Get out of bed, I mean." "Yes, I do, because the alternative is giving up, and I'm too stubborn for that." She squeezed his hand. "I choose to keep going, Caleb. Not because I've forgiven James Whitmore or his father, or all the people who believed their lies. Not because the pain has gone away, or because I've made peace with what happened. I keep going because I refuse to let them take anything else from me. They took my past, but they don't get my future." The strength in her voice, the fierce determination, made something crack open inside Caleb's chest, something that had been frozen solid for 8 years. She was right. He'd let one terrible moment define his entire existence, had given his guilt and shame so much power that they'd consumed everything else. "I don't know if I can do that," he admitted. I don't know if I can move forward. Then don't think about moving forward. Just think about tomorrow, about the next day, about whether you want to sit alone at that table or whether you want to share it with someone who understands. She looked at him, her hazel eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. You don't have to figure everything out at once, Caleb. You just have to decide whether you want to keep punishing yourself or whether you want to try something different. And what would that look like? Something different. I don't know. Her lips curved into a small smile. But maybe we could figure it out together. They sat there on the schoolhouse steps as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, their hands still clasped, neither of them speaking. Around them, Bramble Creek continued its Saturday evening routine, families heading home from the general store, children playing one last game before supper, the distant sound of someone playing a fiddle in their parlor. It was ordinary and peaceful and achingly beautiful, and for the first time in 8 years, Caleb allowed himself to be part of it. Not separate, not watching from the outside, but actually present in the moment, actually connected to another human being, actually feeling something other than guilt and shame and endless crushing loneliness. Thank you, he said finally. For what? For sitting down without asking, for not giving up on me, for... He struggled to find the words. For making me remember what it feels like to be alive. Evelyn's smile was soft and sad and hopeful all at once. Thank you for letting me in. I know it wasn't easy. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, Caleb walked Evelyn home through the darkening streets. But this time when they reached her gate, he didn't immediately turn to leave. Instead, he stood there in the gathering darkness, memorizing the way she looked in the starlight, feeling the ghost of her hand in his. Caleb. Her voice was questioning, gentle. I'm glad you came to Bramble Creek, he said. I'm glad you walked into that saloon. I'm glad you sat at my table. So am I. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that she was changing something fundamental inside him, that for the first time in years he could imagine a future that didn't involve sitting alone in his cabin waiting for time to pass. But the words stuck in his throat too raw and vulnerable to voice. So instead he simply said, Good night, Evelyn. Good night, Caleb. I'll see you tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow. He watched her go inside, then stood at her gate like a damn fool for longer than he should have, before finally heading back to collect his horse. But as he rode home through the Montana night, the stars brilliant overhead and the cold wind biting at his face, Caleb Rowan felt something he hadn't felt in 8 long years. He felt hope, and it scared the hell out of him almost as much as it thrilled him. November gave way to the first bite of December, and with it came a subtle shift in the rhythm of Bramble Creek. The air grew sharper, carrying the promise of snow and clouds that hung low over the mountains. Frost painted the windows each morning in delicate patterns, and folks began preparing in earnest for winter stocking larders, chopping extra wood, checking fences and roofs against the storms that would inevitably come. But the biggest change in Bramble Creek had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the quiet cowboy and the schoolteacher from Philadelphia. Caleb found himself riding into town more frequently than he had in years, always with some excuse ready. He needed supplies from Chen's store. He had to discuss cattle prices with the buyers who came through. His horse needed new shoes from the blacksmith. But everyone in Bramble Creek knew the real reason, even if Caleb himself was still reluctant to admit it fully. He came to town because of Evelyn. Their evening meals at the Silver Spur had become such a fixture that Floyd no longer bothered to ask what they wanted. He simply brought 2 plates of whatever Ida had cooked that day, along with Caleb's whiskey and Evelyn's coffee, and left them to their conversation. The corner table that had once been a symbol of Caleb's isolation had transformed into something else entirely, an island of companionship in the middle of the bustling saloon. But it wasn't just the dinners. Caleb found himself volunteering for things he would have avoided like the plague just months before. When Evelyn mentioned that the schoolhouse needed new desks, he spent 3 days in his workshop building them, his hands remembering skills his father had taught him decades ago. When she worried about her students not having warm enough clothes for the coming winter, he somehow ended up helping organize a clothing drive standing awkwardly in the church basement, while Mrs. Sullivan and her ladies sorted through donations and praised him for his community spirit. He helped Evelyn hang curtains in the schoolhouse windows. He repaired the broken step on the teacherage porch. He even found himself reading to her students one afternoon when she asked if he'd share what it was like to be a deputy marshal, the children sitting cross-legged on the floor with rapt attention as he carefully edited his stories to remove the blood and violence, focusing instead on the vast beauty of the territory and the satisfaction of helping people. "You're good with them," Evelyn had said afterward as they watched the children pour out of the schoolhouse into the winter afternoon. "The children. They look up to you. I just answered some questions. You did more than that. You showed them that someone they respect values education, values learning. That matters more than you know." She'd touched his arm briefly, a gesture that had become more common between them, these small moments of physical contact that never lasted long enough but somehow sustained him through the days when he didn't see her. The town noticed, of course. Bramble Creek was too small for anything to go unnoticed, and the transformation of Caleb Rowan from isolated ghost to active community member was the most fascinating development in recent memory. The betting pool at the Silver Spur, originally about whether Caleb would keep sharing his table with Evelyn, had evolved into speculation about when he'd finally work up the courage to court her properly. "Man's completely besotted," Floyd declared one evening when Caleb was out of earshot walking Evelyn home. "Hasn't seen it himself yet, but everyone else can." "Give him time," Ida said, wiping down the bar with a knowing smile. "Some men take longer to figure out their own hearts. But he'll get there, Mrs." Sullivan, who'd initially been skeptical about the propriety of a single school teacher spending so much time with a man of uncertain reputation, had softened considerably after watching them together. "I don't think I've ever seen two people more perfectly suited for each other," she confided to Edna Pritchard. "Both of them carrying their wounds, both of them trying so hard to be brave. It's really quite romantic." But the person most affected by the changes was Caleb himself. He was aware in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The walls he'd built so carefully around his heart were crumbling, and while part of him wanted to shore them up to protect himself from potential pain, a larger part, the part that came alive when Evelyn smiled at him, wanted nothing more than to let those walls fall completely. He thought about her constantly. While working his ranch, he'd find his mind wandering to something she'd said the night before, some observation about her students, or story from her past. While riding the fence line, he'd catch himself imagining what she was doing at that moment, whether she was teaching grammar or reading aloud from whatever book had captured her attention. At night, lying in his bed, he'd replay their conversations, the sound of her laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she was passionate about something. It had been so long since he'd felt this way, since he'd felt anything beyond guilt and grief, that at first he didn't recognize it for what it was. He told himself it was simply friendship, companionship, the natural pleasure of finding someone who understood him. But deep down in the part of himself he was still afraid to fully examine, he knew the truth. He was falling in love with Evelyn Mercer. The realization hit him one evening in mid-December as they sat in the schoolhouse after hours. Evelyn had been preparing for the Christmas pageant, an annual tradition that apparently was a very big deal in Bramble Creek, and had drafted Caleb into helping paint sets. They'd been working in companionable silence, Caleb carefully painting a stable, while Evelyn worked on what was supposed to be a star, but looked more like a lopsided sun. "I'm terrible at this," she said, laughing at her own creation. "In Philadelphia, I taught literature and mathematics. Art was definitely not my strong suit." "Looks fine to me." "Caleb Rowan, you're a terrible liar." She set down her brush and came over to inspect his work. Standing close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the paint smudged on her cheek just below her left eye. "Now that, on the other hand, is actually quite good. You have hidden talents." "Just painting a barn, nothing special." "It's not just a barn, it's a stable where the Christ child was born. That makes it very special indeed." She smiled up at him, and something in that smile, the warmth, the trust, the genuine affection, made his chest tighten. Without thinking, without planning, Caleb reached up and brushed his thumb across her cheek, wiping away the smudge of paint. The gesture was gentle, intimate, and the moment his skin touched hers, the entire world seemed to stop. Evelyn's breath caught her eyes, widening slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on his, and in that endless moment, Caleb saw everything he'd been afraid to acknowledge reflected back at him. She felt it too. this pull, this connection, this impossible, terrifying, wonderful thing growing between them. "Evelyn," he said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer hide. Yes, he should step back. He should make some joke about the paint change, the subject rebuild the walls before it was too late. But he was so tired of being careful, so tired of denying himself any chance at happiness, because he thought he didn't deserve it. And the way she was looking at him like he was someone worth looking at, someone worth trusting, someone worth caring about, made him brave in a way he hadn't been in 8 long years. "I need to tell you something," he began, his hand still cupping her face, his thumb now tracing slow circles on her cheek. "These past few weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you. Caleb," her voice was soft, encouraging, "you've changed something in me. Made me remember what it feels like to be part of the world instead of just watching it from a distance. Made me think that maybe, just maybe, I don't have to spend the rest of my life alone." He took a shaky breath. "What I'm trying to say is—" He never got to finish the sentence. Evelyn rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was soft, tentative, a question as much as an answer. Her lips were warm against his, tasting faintly of the coffee she'd been drinking. For a heartbeat, Caleb was too shocked to respond, his entire world narrowing down to the impossible fact that she was kissing him, that this woman he'd come to care about more than he'd thought possible actually wanted him too. Then his arms came around her waist, pulling her closer, and he kissed her back with all the pent-up longing and hope and desperate need he'd been trying so hard to contain. She melted against him, her hands sliding up to grip his shoulders, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more consuming. They broke apart finally, both breathing hard, Evelyn's face flushed, and her hair coming loose from its pins. Caleb kept his arms around her, afraid that if he let go, she might disappear, might realize she'd made a terrible mistake kissing a man like him. "I was trying to tell you I'm falling in love with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. "I know. I'm falling in love with you too." "You are." "Yes, you stubborn man. Why do you think I've been spending every evening at that saloon? It's certainly not for Floyd's ambiance." She laughed, the sound bright and joyful. "I've been waiting for you to say something, to give me some sign that you felt the same way. When you touched my face just now, I couldn't wait any longer." Caleb touched his forehead to hers, marveling at the reality of this moment. "I'm not good at this. Haven't courted a woman in over a decade. Don't know the right things to say or do. You don't need to know the right things. You just need to be honest. Be yourself." She pulled back slightly to look him in the eye. "That's all I want, Caleb. Your honesty, your trust, your time. Everything else we'll figure out together." "Together," he repeated, testing the word. It had been so long since he'd been part of a together, so long since he'd allowed himself to need another person. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." They stood there in the lamplight of the schoolhouse, holding each other, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first real snow of winter, coating Bramble Creek in a blanket of white that muffled all sound and made the world feel small and safe. "We should probably finish these sets," Evelyn said eventually, though she made no move to step away from his embrace. "The pageant is only 2 weeks away, and I still have costumes to coordinate and songs to teach, and approximately 17 things that will probably go wrong despite my best efforts." "Then let them go wrong." Caleb kissed her forehead, another new intimacy that felt both foreign and completely natural. "It's a Christmas pageant put on by children. Nobody expects perfection. You clearly don't know Mrs. Sullivan. She has very high expectations for the Christmas pageant." But Evelyn was smiling as she said it, her earlier stress about the production seeming to melt away. "Though I suppose you're right. The important thing is that the children enjoy it." They returned to their painting, but everything felt different now, charged with new awareness, new possibility. They worked side by side, occasionally stealing glances at each other, sometimes letting their hands brush as they reached for supplies. The easy companionship they'd developed over the past weeks had deepened into something richer, layered with the knowledge that they'd crossed a threshold from which there was no going back. It was past 10 when they finally finished the sets, as complete as they were going to get. Caleb helped Evelyn clean the brushes and put away the paints, their movements synchronized in the way of people who'd grown comfortable working together. Then he walked her home through the snow-covered streets, their breath creating clouds in the frigid air. At her gate, Evelyn hesitated. "Would you like to come in? I could make coffee, or tea if you prefer." Caleb knew what she was really asking, whether he wanted to continue this evening, to sit in her parlor and talk until the early hours of the morning, to pretend for a while longer that the outside world didn't exist. Everything in him wanted to say yes. But he also knew that Bramble Creek was watching, that Evelyn's reputation as the school teacher depended on maintaining certain proprieties, and the last thing he wanted was to damage that reputation simply because he couldn't bear to say goodnight. "I'd like that," he said carefully. "But people talk, Evelyn. If I go inside now, if anyone sees me leaving in an hour or two, they'll talk, and I don't want to cause trouble for you." Understanding flickered across her face, followed by appreciation. "You're right, of course. I wasn't thinking clearly." She paused. "But Caleb, I don't care what people say. Not anymore. I spent too much of my life caring about reputation and propriety, and look where it got me. If people want to talk, let them talk. I care." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "Not for my sake. My reputation can't get much worse than it already is. But for yours. You've worked hard to build a place for yourself here, to earn the respect of these families. I won't do anything to jeopardize that." Evelyn's eyes shone with unshed tears. "How did I get so lucky to find someone who actually cares about protecting me instead of using me? I'm the lucky one." He kissed her softly, a gentle press of lips that promised more for the future. "Get some sleep. I'll see you tomorrow. Dinner at the saloon. Wouldn't miss it." He waited until she was safely inside before turning to collect his horse from where he'd tied it outside the schoolhouse. But instead of heading straight back to his ranch, Caleb found himself riding through the silent, snow-covered streets of Bramble Creek, too keyed up to sleep, too full of emotion to simply go home and sit alone with his thoughts. He'd kissed her. She'd kissed him. They'd admitted their feelings for each other. After 8 years of isolation, of convincing himself he didn't deserve love or happiness or any kind of future beyond mere survival, he'd found someone who made him believe otherwise. Someone who saw all his broken pieces and wanted him anyway. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing he'd ever experienced. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Evelyn threw herself into organizing the Christmas pageant with the focused intensity she brought to everything she did, while Caleb found himself roped into helping with increasingly bizarre tasks. He built a wooden manger for the baby Jesus doll. He helped string garland around the schoolhouse. He even found himself attempting to teach Billy Thompson how to deliver his lines as Joseph with some semblance of conviction. "I just don't understand why Joseph has to talk so much," Billy complained, his 12-year-old face screwed up in concentration as he tried to memorize his part. "Shouldn't Mary do most of the talking?" "You're the head of the household," Caleb explained, trying to remember what little he knew about the Christmas story. "You've got to tell the innkeeper you need a room, got to explain to Mary that the stable is the best you can do. It's important." "I guess." Billy didn't look convinced. "My pa says you and Miss Mercer are courting." The statement caught Caleb off guard. "Does he now?" "Yep, says he's never seen you smile so much, which means Miss Mercer must be pretty special." Billy looked up at him with the unfiltered honesty of childhood. "Are you going to marry her?" Caleb felt heat creep up the back of his neck. "That's not really something you ask a man, Billy." "Why not everyone in town's already talking about it? Mrs. Sullivan told my ma she's expecting a spring wedding. Doc Pritchard bet Floyd $20 you'd propose by Christmas. Even the Reverend mentioned something about being ready to perform a ceremony whenever you're ready." The entire town was apparently invested in his love life. The thought should have annoyed him, but instead Caleb found it oddly touching. These people, his neighbors, his community, weren't gossiping out of malice. They were hopeful, rooting for him, wanting him to find happiness after years of self-imposed exile. "Tell you what, Billy will," Caleb said, changing the subject. "How about we focus on making sure you don't forget your lines during the pageant and you let the grown-ups worry about their own business?" Billy grinned. "Yes, sir. But for what it's worth, I think Miss Mercer's real nice. And you seem a whole lot less scary since she showed up." "Less scary, huh? Well, you smile now, and you helped with the school and everything. That's pretty nice for someone who used to just sit alone and glare at people." Out of the mouths of babes, Caleb thought amused despite himself. Go on now. Your ma's probably wondering where you got to. As Billy scampered off, Evelyn emerged from the schoolhouse, a clipboard in hand and a slightly frazzled expression on her face. Please tell me you've had better luck with Billy than I've had with the angels. Emma Pritchard and Sally Martinez are in a heated argument about who gets to stand closest to the manger, and I'm fairly certain Sarah Chen is going to cry because her halo keeps falling off. Welcome to the glamorous world of theater direction. Caleb caught her as she stumbled on the icy step, his hands going to her waist to steady her. Careful. Thank you. She smiled up at him momentarily, forgetting her clipboard and her stressed angels. Have I mentioned today how glad I am that you're here? Once or twice? Well, I'm saying it again. I couldn't do this without you. She glanced around to make sure none of her students were watching, then rose on her toes and kissed him quickly. There. Now I feel better. Evelyn Mercer, are you using me as stress relief? Absolutely. Is that a problem? Not even a little bit. They shared a smile, one of those private moments that felt like a secret even in broad daylight. Then Evelyn sighed and consulted her clipboard. I should get back to it. We're doing a full run-through tomorrow afternoon, and I'm fairly certain it's going to be a disaster, but a lovable disaster, hopefully. It'll be perfect. You're biased. Maybe. But I'm also right. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, letting his fingers linger against her temple. You've worked hard on this. The kids have worked hard. Whatever happens tomorrow, it'll be something special, because you made it so. The look she gave him was full of warmth and affection, and something deeper, something that made his heart beat faster. I love you, Caleb Rowan. Have I mentioned that? Not in the last few hours. Well, I'm mentioning it now. I love you. Desperately, completely, probably unwisely, given that we've known each other less than 2 months. But I do. Caleb kissed her properly, then not caring who might see, not caring about propriety or reputation or anything beyond the simple truth of how he felt. I love you too, more than I thought I'd ever love anything again. The full run-through of the Christmas pageant the next day was indeed a disaster, but an endearing one. Billy Thompson forgot half his lines and had to be prompted by Emma Pritchard, who was supposed to be an angel, but apparently moonlighted as Joseph's understudy. The star that Evelyn had painted fell off its wire and nearly hit the baby Jesus doll. 3 of the shepherds got into a shoving match about whose turn it was to hold the staff, and the final song, Silent Night, was performed in approximately 7 different keys, none of them correct. But the children were enthusiastic and joyful, and when they took their bows at the end, beaming with pride, despite all the mistakes, Evelyn's eyes were shining with unshed tears. It's going to be wonderful, Mrs. Sullivan declared, having watched the entire rehearsal with a critical eye. Rough around the edges, certainly, but wonderful nonetheless. You've done excellent work with them, Miss Mercer. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, though I should mention that Mr. Rowan deserves much of the credit. He's been invaluable. Mrs. Sullivan turned her appraising gaze on Caleb, who stood slightly behind Evelyn, trying to remain inconspicuous. Yes, Mr. Rowan has been quite helpful lately, quite the change from his previous habits. There was no censure in her voice, only approval, and perhaps a hint of matchmaking satisfaction. Caleb nodded acknowledgement, unsure what to say. He'd never been good at accepting compliments or navigating the complex social dynamics that women like Mrs. Sullivan seemed to manage effortlessly. But Evelyn saved him as she so often did. Mr. Rowan has a generous heart. The whole town is lucky to have him. Indeed we are. Mrs. Sullivan smiled, the expression transforming her usually stern face into something almost grandmotherly. I do hope we'll continue to see more of you at community events, Mr. Rowan. It's good for Bramble Creek when all its citizens participate. After the rehearsal ended and the children had been collected by their parents, Caleb helped Evelyn tidy up the schoolhouse. They worked in comfortable silence, putting away props and straightening chairs, until finally the room was organized and ready for the actual performance in 2 days' time. I'm exhausted, Evelyn admitted, sinking into her desk chair. But it's a good exhaustion, a productive exhaustion. You need to eat. Come on, let's head to the saloon. In a minute. She caught his hand as he moved to help her up. Sit with me for a moment. Caleb pulled up one of the student chairs far too small for his frame and sat facing her, their knees almost touching in the cramped space. "What's on your mind?" "Christmas. It's my first Christmas away from Philadelphia, away from my family." Her voice was carefully neutral, but he could hear the hurt underneath. "I know they chose their reputation over me. I know they believed the lies instead of their own daughter, but I still miss them, my mother especially. We used to spend Christmas Eve making cookies together, just the two of us in the kitchen, while my father read in his study. It was our tradition." Caleb squeezed her hand, wishing he had words that could ease that particular pain. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault. And honestly, being here, having the pageant to focus on having you, it helps. I'm not as alone as I thought I'd be." She looked up at him, vulnerability written across her face. "What about you? Do you have family somewhere, Christmas plans?" "My parents died when I was 20. No siblings. Christmas has mostly just been another day for me." He paused, then added, "But I'd like to spend it with you, if you'll have me." Evelyn's smile was incandescent. "I'd like nothing better. We could have dinner at the teacherage. I'll cook or attempt to cook. I should warn you, my culinary skills are somewhat limited, but I make a reasonably decent roast chicken. I don't care what we eat. I just want to be with you." "Then it's settled. Christmas Day, just the two of us." She stood, pulling him up with her. "Though I should probably warn you, Mrs. Sullivan has invited us both to Christmas Eve dinner at her house. Apparently it's another Bramble Creek tradition, a big community meal where everyone brings a dish. You said yes. I said I'd ask you first, but Caleb..." She moved closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. "I want to go. I want to sit at that dinner table with you, be part of this community, as your..." She hesitated, then continued, "As whatever we are to each other. I'm tired of hiding what I feel, tired of pretending we're just friends sharing meals." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, and he knew she could feel it beneath her palm. They'd been careful these past few days, maintaining propriety in public, keeping their affection relatively private. But she was right. They were past the point of pretending, past the point of just friendship. "What do you want to be?" he asked quietly. "To each other, I mean." "Yours," she said simply. "I want to be yours, and I want you to be mine. I want everyone in Bramble Creek to know that I love you, and you love me, and we're building something real together." She paused. "Unless that's moving too fast, unless you're not ready for..." He kissed her, cutting off her words, pouring 8 years of loneliness and longing and desperate hope into that kiss. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm ready," he said. "I'm terrified, but I'm ready. We'll go to Mrs. Sullivan's Christmas Eve dinner. We'll let the whole damn town know that you're mine and I'm yours, and then we'll figure out the rest as we go." "Together," Evelyn whispered. "Together," he agreed. The night of the Christmas pageant arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. The entire town packed into the schoolhouse, families crowding onto benches, children sitting cross-legged on the floor, even some folks standing along the walls because there simply wasn't enough space. Floyd had closed the Silver Spur for the evening, so he and Ida could attend. Doc Pritchard and his wife sat in the front row, beaming with grandparental pride at Emma. Samuel Chen and his family had brought rice cakes to share during intermission, a gesture that represented the blending of cultures that made Bramble Creek unique. Caleb stood at the back with the other men watching as Evelyn organized her students behind the makeshift curtain they'd rigged up. She was in her element, directing with quiet authority, encouraging nervous children, fixing last-minute costume malfunctions. She'd worn her nicest dress, deep green wool, that brought out the color of her eyes, and had pinned her hair up in an elaborate style that must have taken considerable effort. She was beautiful, Caleb thought, but more than that, she was radiant with purpose and joy, completely in her element, doing what she was born to do. The pageant itself was imperfect and wonderful. Billy Thompson forgot his lines twice, but recovered with admirable poise. The star stayed attached this time, though it wobbled precariously during the shepherd scene. Emma Pritchard delivered her angel speech with such earnest conviction that several mothers in the audience were openly weeping. And when the children joined together for the final song, their young voices filling the schoolhouse with Silent Night, even the most cynical hearts in Bramble Creek felt the magic of the moment. After the performance, during the applause and congratulations, Caleb made his way to Evelyn's side. She was accepting praise from parents, her cheeks flushed with pleasure and relief that it had gone well. When she saw him, her entire face lit up. "We did it," she said, reaching for his hand without thinking, without caring who saw. "It actually worked. You did it. I just hammered some nails and painted a barn." "You did so much more than that." She squeezed his hand, and he became aware that the crowd around them had gone quiet, watching this exchange with barely concealed interest. "Thank you, Caleb, for everything." He should probably drop her hand, step back, maintain some semblance of appropriate distance. But Evelyn had said she was tired of hiding, and so was he. So instead, right there in the middle of the schoolhouse, with half of Bramble Creek watching, Caleb Rowan raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. The gesture was old-fashioned, courtly, and unmistakably romantic. A collective sigh rose from the assembled crowd. "Merry Christmas, Evelyn," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas, Caleb." Mrs. Sullivan chose that moment to bustle forward, her expression one of profound satisfaction. "Wonderful pageant, Miss Mercer. Simply wonderful. Now I trust we'll see you both at dinner tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock sharp." "We'll be there," Evelyn confirmed. And the look she shared with Caleb was full of promise and hope, and the knowledge that they were about to take another step forward together, letting the world see what they'd both known for weeks now. They were in love, and they were done hiding it. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the kind of Montana winter day where the air itself seemed to crystallize, each breath visible as frost, every sound carrying sharp and distinct across the frozen landscape. Caleb woke before sunrise, as was his habit, but instead of the familiar heaviness that usually accompanied his mornings, he felt something different. Anticipation, nervous energy. The flutter of emotion he hadn't experienced since he was a young man preparing for his first real courting. He was going to Mrs. Sullivan's dinner with Evelyn. Not as two friends who happened to share meals, not as the reclusive rancher doing a favor for the new school teacher, but as a couple. As two people who loved each other and were ready for the whole town to witness that truth. The thought terrified him almost as much as it thrilled him. He spent longer than usual getting ready. Shaving carefully, trimming his hair as best he could manage with the small mirror in his cabin, changing his shirt 3 times before settling on the dark gray one that Evelyn had once mentioned she liked. He even dug out his good boots, the ones he'd bought years ago for formal occasions and had barely worn since coming to Bramble Creek. By the time he rode into town that evening, the sun was already setting, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of pink and gold. Windows glowed with lamplight and candles, and he could smell wood smoke and cooking food on the cold air. Christmas Eve in Bramble Creek was clearly a significant occasion, with decorations visible in every window and the sound of carols drifting from the church where the choir was practicing. He stopped first at the teacherage as they'd arranged. Evelyn answered his knock almost immediately, and the sight of her made his breath catch. She wore a dress of deep burgundy that he'd never seen before, fitted at the waist and falling in elegant folds to the floor. Her hair was swept up with small sprigs of evergreen tucked into the arrangement, and she'd somehow acquired a delicate necklace, simple gold, with a small pearl that drew his eye to the graceful line of her neck. "You're beautiful," he said, the words coming out rougher than intended. Evelyn's smile was both pleased and slightly nervous. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." She gestured to the covered dish she held. "I made sweet potato casserole. Mrs. Sullivan's instructions were very specific about what I should bring. I'm sure it's perfect." He offered his arm and she took it, pulling the door closed behind her. "Ready for this?" "Ready as I'll ever be. Though I should warn you, Mrs. Sullivan has been dropping hints all week about how lovely it will be to have a proper couple at her table. I think she's been planning this evening since the moment you kissed my hand at the pageant. The whole town's been planning this since you sat down at my table that first night." Caleb helped her navigate the icy path to where he'd tied his horse. "I stopped by the Silver Spur yesterday to settle my tab, and Floyd winked at me. Actually, winked. Then he said something about how he'd known all along we were meant for each other." Evelyn laughed, the sound bright in the cold air. "I got similar commentary from Mrs. Chen at the general store. Apparently there's been a betting pool about when you'd properly court me. Did you know Doc Pritchard stands to win $20 if you propose before New Year's get?" Billy Thompson mentioned something about that. Caleb lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his arm coming around her waist to steady her. She leaned back against him naturally, as if they'd been riding this way for years instead of this being the first time. Does it bother you? All the attention? Honestly, no. She turned her head slightly to look at him, her profile lovely in the fading light. In Philadelphia, I lived under constant scrutiny, every action judged, every choice examined for propriety. But this feels different. These people aren't judging us. They're rooting for us. They want us to be happy. They do, Caleb agreed, guiding the horse through the snowy streets. This town's got its quirks, but at its heart, it's made up of good people who look after their own. And we're part of that now, both of us. The wonder in her voice told him how much that meant to her, this belonging, this acceptance after being cast out from everything she'd known. Mrs. Sullivan's house was ablaze with light, every window glowing, the sound of conversation and laughter spilling out into the night. Caleb helped Evelyn down from the horse, then grabbed the casserole dish while she smoothed her skirts and took a deep breath. "Here we go," she murmured. "Together," he reminded her, and she smiled, squaring her shoulders. The moment they walked through the door, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to take in the sight of Caleb Rowan and Evelyn Mercer arriving together, his hand at the small of her back, her face turned toward his with unmistakable affection, and then Mrs. Sullivan swept forward with the force of a general marshalling her troops. "Miss Mercer, Mr. Rowan, how wonderful that you could join us. Come in, come in. Let me take that casserole. Oh, it smells divine. Everyone, you remember our school teacher and Mr. Rowan, of course." As if anyone could forget, Caleb thought wryly. But the crowd's reaction was warm welcoming. Floyd and Ida came forward to greet them, Floyd still wearing that knowing grin. Doc Pritchard raised his glass of bourbon in salute. Samuel Chen and his wife offered friendly nods. Even the younger people, Billy Thompson and Emma Pritchard, and the other students who'd been in the pageant, seemed excited to see their teacher and the man who'd helped with the sets. The Sullivan house, spacious by Bramble Creek standards, had been transformed for the occasion. Pine garland draped every surface, red ribbons tied in elaborate bows. Candles flickered on every flat surface, casting dancing shadows. The dining table, actually 3 tables pushed together and covered with Mrs. Sullivan's best linens, groaned under the weight of food: roasted turkeys and hams, mashed potatoes and gravy cranberry sauce, and rolls, casseroles, and pies, and enough desserts to feed an army. Caleb found himself separated from Evelyn, almost immediately pulled into conversation with the men, while she was swept away by the ladies, all of whom seemed to have urgent questions about her casserole recipe or her Christmas plans. He watched her across the room, saw her laughing at something Mrs. Chen said, saw the way she'd relaxed into the warmth of community, and felt something fierce and protective surge through him. She belonged here. She'd found her place in Bramble Creek, carved out a life from nothing, earned the respect and affection of people who'd initially been skeptical of an Eastern school teacher with fancy dresses and refined speech. And somehow, impossibly, she'd chosen to love him, a broken-down former lawman who'd spent 8 years hiding from the world. "You've got it bad," Floyd said quietly, appearing at Caleb's elbow with 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Caleb. "Never seen a man look at a woman the way you look at her." "Is it that obvious?" To everyone with eyes, yes. Floyd took a sip of his drink. "But that's not a bad thing, Caleb. Love's not something to be ashamed of or hide. It's a gift, especially when it's returned." "I know, it's just—" Caleb struggled to find the words. "It's been so long since I let myself feel anything. Sometimes I worry I'm going to mess this up, push her away, let my past ruin what we're building." "Then don't," Floyd's voice was matter-of-fact. "It's that simple. You've spent 8 years punishing yourself for a mistake made in an impossible situation. Maybe it's time to forgive yourself and move forward. God knows Miss Mercer seems willing to help you do that." Before Caleb could respond, Mrs. Sullivan clapped her hands for attention. "Everyone, please find your seats. We're about to begin." The seating arrangement was strategic, Caleb realized immediately. He and Evelyn had been placed side by side at the center of the table, surrounded by the town's most prominent citizens. Mrs. Sullivan sat at the head naturally, with her late husband's chair conspicuously empty. Doc and Mrs. Pritchard flanked one side, Floyd and Ida the other. The Chens, the Thompsons, the Martinezes. All the families who'd become part of Caleb and Evelyn's lives over the past 2 months filled the remaining spaces. Reverend Matthews, a kindly man in his 60s who ran Bramble Creek's small church, stood to say grace. Lord, we thank you for this gathering of friends and neighbors, for the food before us, and the warmth of fellowship. We thank you for bringing Miss Mercer to our community and for bringing Mr. Rowan back into our fold after too long in isolation. As we celebrate the birth of your son, we remember that you sent him to bring light into darkness, hope into despair, and love into lonely hearts. May we honor that gift by opening our own hearts to each other. Amen. The amen that echoed around the table was heartfelt, and Caleb felt Evelyn's hand find his beneath the table, squeezing gently. He squeezed back, overwhelmed by the simple acceptance of this community, the way they'd welcomed him back after years of self-imposed exile, the way they'd embraced Evelyn without knowing anything of her past beyond what she'd chosen to share. The meal was boisterous and warm conversation flowing as freely as the wine and cider. Stories were shared, funny anecdotes about students' tales from the harsh Montana winters, memories of Christmases past. Caleb found himself drawn into the conversation despite his usual reticence, encouraged by Evelyn's presence at his side and the genuine interest of the people around him. Mr. Rowan, young Emma Pritchard, piped up from down the table. My grandfather says you once tracked an outlaw all the way from Helena to the Canadian border. Is that true? Caleb glanced at Doc, who shrugged apologetically. I may have mentioned some of your exploits from your martial days. It's true, Caleb admitted. Though it wasn't quite as exciting as it sounds, mostly just long days of riding and camping in the rain. Did you catch him? Billy Thompson asked, his eyes wide with interest. Eventually. He made the mistake of stopping at a trading post for supplies. I'd been checking every trading post along his route, so when he showed up, I was waiting. Were you scared? Emma asked. Caleb considered the question seriously. These children deserved honesty, not romanticized stories of adventure. Yes, every lawman who says he's not scared when facing a dangerous criminal is either a liar or a fool. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you careful. The trick is not letting it paralyze you. That's good advice for more than just law enforcement, Reverend Matthews observed. Fear is a natural response to the unknown, but we can't let it stop us from doing what's right, from reaching for what we need. The look he gave Caleb was knowing, gentle, and Caleb understood that the Reverend wasn't just talking about catching outlaws. He was talking about life, about love, about the risks inherent in opening your heart after trauma. Evelyn's hand tightened on his beneath the table, and he turned to look at her. Her eyes were bright with emotion, and he knew she'd understood the Reverend's message too. After dinner came desserts, so many pies and cakes and pastries that the table could barely hold them all. Ida's apple pie, which Caleb had praised on his first shared meal with Evelyn, was there alongside Mrs. Chen's almond cookies, Mrs. Thompson's pumpkin pie, and at least half a dozen other creations. Evelyn had contributed a tray of chocolate cookies that disappeared almost immediately, much to her surprised delight. Where did you learn to bake like this? Mrs. Sullivan asked, her tone approving as she sampled one of Evelyn's cookies. My mother. Before... Evelyn paused, and Caleb saw the flash of pain cross her face. Before I came west, we used to bake together. It was something we shared. You must miss her, Mrs. Pritchard said gently. Every day. Evelyn's voice was soft but steady. Especially at Christmas. But being here with all of you, it helps. You've made me feel welcome, made me feel like I have a family again. You do have a family, Mrs. Sullivan declared, reaching across to pat Evelyn's hand. We all do. That's what community means, dear. We look after our own. The conversation gradually shifted to planning for the New Year talk, of a spring social discussion of needed improvements to the school, speculation about whether the winter would be harsh or mild. Caleb listened with half an ear, more focused on the woman beside him, the way she'd blossomed in the warmth of acceptance, the way her laugh came more easily now than it had that first night in the saloon. As the evening wore on and people began making noises about heading home, Mrs. Sullivan stood and raised her glass. Before we conclude this lovely evening, I'd like to make a toast to Bramble Creek, to the friends who make it home, and to new beginnings. May this Christmas bring joy to all our hearts and hope for the year ahead." Everyone raised their glasses, echoing the sentiment. But Caleb noticed that Mrs. Sullivan's gaze lingered on him, and Evelyn her smile knowing and satisfied, and he had the distinct impression that she was toasting more than just the holiday. They helped clean up afterward, carrying dishes to the kitchen, wiping down tables, generally making themselves useful, despite Mrs. Sullivan's protests that they were guests. But Evelyn insisted, and where Evelyn went, Caleb followed, content to dry dishes, while she washed to store leftovers, while she wrapped them to simply be near her. "That was wonderful," Evelyn said quietly as they worked side by side at the sink, the kitchen momentarily empty of others. "Everything I hoped it would be and more." "You were nervous." "Terrified, actually. I kept thinking about Philadelphia, about those awful dinners where everyone smiled to my face and gossiped behind my back, where every word was measured, every gesture calculated." She rinsed a plate and handed it to him. "But this was different. These people are genuine. When they say they're glad I'm here, they mean it." "They do mean it. You've made a real difference in this town, Evelyn. The children adore you, the parents respect you, and you've brought life back to that schoolhouse that it hasn't had in years." "I couldn't have done it without you." She set down the dish she'd been washing and turned to face him fully. "You gave me confidence when I needed it, most supported me when I doubted myself, helped me see that I could build something real here. I think you would have managed just fine without me." "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." She reached up, touching his face gently, seemingly unconcerned that someone might walk into the kitchen and see them. "I love you, Caleb. I know I've said it before, but I want you to understand I'm not going anywhere. Whatever fears you have about your past ruining this, whatever doubts plague you in the dark hours of the morning, I need you to know that I'm here for the long term." Caleb set down the dish towel and pulled her close right there in Mrs. Sullivan's kitchen, with the sounds of the party winding down in the other room. "I love you too, more than I thought possible. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to hope, to dream, to imagine a future that's about more than just surviving." "Then imagine it with me." Her voice was barely a whisper. "A real future, you and me building a life together." He knew what she was asking, could read the question in her eyes, even though she hadn't spoken it aloud. She wanted forever. She wanted marriage and a home and all the complicated, beautiful, terrifying things that came with truly binding your life to another person's. And God help him, he wanted that too. "Evelyn," he began. But before he could continue, Mrs. Sullivan bustled into the kitchen with an armload of dishes. "Oh, well, isn't this cozy?" Her tone was pleased rather than scandalized. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Caleb and Evelyn stepped apart, though not quickly enough to hide their obvious closeness. Mrs. Sullivan's smile grew wider. "Actually, I'm glad to catch you both here. I wanted to speak with you about something." "Of course," Evelyn said, her cheeks slightly flushed. Mrs. Sullivan set down her dishes and turned to face them with the air of someone about to make a pronouncement. "The town council met last week and we've been discussing the future of our school. Miss Mercer, your contract runs through the end of the school year, but we'd very much like to extend it. In fact, we'd like to offer you a permanent position if you're willing to stay." Evelyn's face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "Mrs. Sullivan, that's wonderful. Of course I'm willing to stay. I can't imagine leaving Bramble Creek now." "Excellent. We'll draw up the new contract after the first of the year." Mrs. Sullivan turned her attention to Caleb. "And Mr. Rowan, the council, has also been discussing how we might improve our school facilities. We were wondering if you'd be willing to take on some carpentry work come spring, perhaps building new desks, repairing the floor, maybe even adding a small addition if we can raise the funds. We'd pay you fairly for your time and expertise, of course." Caleb was taken aback. He'd helped with the school as a favor to Evelyn, not expecting or wanting any kind of official recognition. "Mrs. Sullivan, I appreciate the offer, but before you say no, consider this." Mrs. Sullivan interrupted gently. "You're skilled at woodworking. You clearly care about education given how you've helped Miss Mercer, and this town needs someone reliable to maintain its public buildings. It would be steady work, good pay, and it would keep you in town more regularly." The last part was said with a meaningful glance at Evelyn, and Caleb understood what Mrs. Sullivan was really saying. If he and Evelyn were going to build a life together, it would be easier if he wasn't living 10 miles outside of town, isolated on his ranch. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course. But Caleb and I hope you don't mind me calling you that I think you should seriously consider it. You've been on the outskirts of this community for too long. It's time to come all the way in." After the dinner finally concluded and they'd said their goodbyes to what felt like half of Bramble Creek, Caleb walked Evelyn back to the teachridge through streets that had grown quiet. Most families tucked into their homes for the night. The cold was intense now, the kind that made your bones ache, but Caleb barely noticed it with Evelyn pressed close to his side, his arm around her waist. "Mrs. Sullivan's not subtle, is she?" Evelyn said, amusement coloring her voice. "About as subtle as a charging bull." "But she's not wrong. About the carpentry work, I mean." Evelyn looked up at him as they walked. "You are good at it, and the school does need improvements, and it would mean seeing you more often, which I fully support." "You'd see me regardless. I'm at that saloon every evening anyway." "True. But imagine if you were actually part of the town, not just visiting. If you had work here connections beyond just me. Caleb, you were a lawman, you're built for community, for helping people. Hiding out on your ranch all these years, it's not who you really are." He knew she was right, had known it on some level for weeks now. The isolation he'd cultivated had never been natural to him, had always been a punishment he'd inflicted on himself rather than a genuine desire for solitude. But old habits were hard to break, and the fear of getting too close, of having too much to lose again, still lurked in the corners of his mind. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "I promise I'll seriously consider Mrs. Sullivan's offer." "That's all I ask." They'd reached the teachridge, and Evelyn turned to face him on the porch, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "Would you like to come in? I know it's Christmas Eve, and maybe you'd rather head back to your ranch, but—" "I'd like to come in," Caleb said, cutting off her nervous rambling. "If you're sure." "I'm sure." She unlocked the door and led him into the small parlor, which she'd decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons in the style of the season. A small fire still burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Let me make us some coffee, or would you prefer tea?" "Coffee's fine." Caleb removed his hat and coat, hanging them on the hook by the door, then moved to the fireplace to add another log. The domesticity of the moment struck him, this comfortable routine of someone making coffee while he tended the fire, the easy familiarity of being in her space. It felt like home, like a glimpse of what their life could be if he was brave enough to reach for it. Evelyn returned with 2 cups of coffee and settled beside him on the small sofa, close enough that their shoulders touched. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire, sipping their drinks, simply being together. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said eventually. "Always." Earlier in the kitchen, before Mrs. Sullivan interrupted. "What were you going to say?" Caleb set down his coffee cup, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. This was it. The moment he'd been both anticipating and dreading, the moment when he had to decide whether to play it safe or risk everything. He thought about the past 8 years, about the loneliness and isolation, about the crushing weight of guilt he'd carried like a millstone. He thought about that first night when Evelyn had sat down at his table without asking about the way she'd made him laugh, made him hope, made him believe he deserved a second chance. He thought about her courage in leaving everything she knew, her determination to build a new life, her willingness to love him despite all his broken pieces. And he made his choice. "I was going to say that I've been thinking about the future," he began, turning to face her fully. "About what kind of life I want, what kind of man I want to be. And Evelyn, the only future I can imagine, the only one that makes any sense, is one with you in it." Her eyes widened, her breath catching. "Caleb, I'm not good at this. I don't have a ring, don't have pretty words prepared, but I know that I love you, that I want to spend whatever time I have left on this earth, making you happy, building a life with you being the man you deserve." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Evelyn. If you'll take a chance on a broken-down former lawman who comes with more baggage than any woman should have to deal with." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was smiling, that radiant smile that transformed her entire face. "Yes. Yes, of course I'll marry you. I'd marry you tomorrow if it were possible." Relief and joy and a dozen other emotions flooded through Caleb in a rush so powerful it left him dizzy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling her heart beat against his chest in perfect rhythm with his own. She was laughing and crying at the same time, her face buried in his shoulder, her hands gripping his shirt as if she was afraid he might disappear. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "God, Evelyn, I love you so much." "I love you too, so much." She pulled back to look at him, her face wet with tears but glowing with happiness. When can we get married?" "Whenever you want, tomorrow, next week, next month, I don't care as long as it happens." "Christmas Day," she said suddenly. "Tomorrow, let's get married on Christmas Day." Caleb laughed, caught between disbelief and delight. "Tomorrow, Evelyn, we can't possibly organize a wedding in less than 24 hours. "Why not?" "We don't need anything fancy, just Reverend Matthews, maybe a few witnesses. We could do it in the church or here or anywhere, really. I don't care about the details, Caleb. I just want to be your wife." The simple directness of her statement, the absolute certainty in her voice made his decision easy. "All right, Christmas Day. I'll talk to Reverend Matthews first thing in the morning." "Really?" She looked almost surprised that he'd agreed. "Really? I've wasted 8 years already. I'm not wasting another day." She kissed him then, and the kiss was different from the others they'd shared, deeper, more urgent, carrying the promise of everything to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn rested her forehead against his. "Doc Pritchard is going to win his bet," she said, laughter in her voice. "Let him. Hell, I'll give him an extra $20 just for being right." Caleb kissed her again, softer this time. "I should go. It's late, and we both need to sleep before tomorrow." "Stay," Evelyn said quietly. I don't mean—" She blushed, stumbling over her words. "I just mean stay here on the sofa, sleep by the fire. I don't want to be apart from you tonight, not when tomorrow we're getting married." It was improper and would certainly cause talk if anyone found out, but Caleb found he didn't care. He was done living his life based on fear of what others might think. "All right, I'll stay." Evelyn fetched blankets and pillows, making a comfortable nest on the sofa while Caleb banked the fire. Then she curled up beside him, her head on his chest, his arms around her, and they lay there in the firelight talking quietly about their plans for tomorrow, for the future, for all the days to come. "We should probably tell people," Evelyn murmured sleepily, "before we just show up at the church expecting to get married." "We'll tell them in the morning, though I suspect Mrs. Sullivan will claim she knew all along." "She probably did," Evelyn yawned, snuggling closer. "Everyone probably did except us. We were a little slow on the uptake." "Speak for yourself. I knew I wanted to marry you about 2 weeks after we met." She tilted her head to look at him. "Is that crazy? To know so quickly?" "If it is, then we're both crazy. Because I think I knew the first night when you sat down at my table without asking. I knew my life had just changed, even if I didn't understand how yet." They talked until the early hours of the morning, making plans, sharing dreams, occasionally kissing just because they could. And when they finally fell asleep, still wrapped in each other's arms, Caleb Rowan slept more peacefully than he had in 8 years. Because tomorrow he would marry the woman he loved. Tomorrow he would start a new life. Leave the past behind, embrace a future full of hope and possibility. Tomorrow he would prove to himself and to Evelyn and to everyone who'd believed in him that he was worthy of a second chance. Tomorrow everything would change. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Caleb was ready for it. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow falling soft and silent over Bramble Creek, transforming the town into something out of a storybook, all white-covered roofs and frosted windows, the world hushed and pristine. Caleb woke to find pale sunlight filtering through the teacherage curtains, and Evelyn still asleep against his chest, her hair spread across his shirt, one hand resting over his heart. He lay still for a long moment, afraid to move and break the spell, cataloging every detail of this perfect moment, the weight of her against him, the sound of her breathing, the way the morning light painted her face in soft gold. In a few hours, if everything went according to their impulsive plan, she would be his wife. The thought filled him with equal parts joy and terror. Evelyn stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and when she saw him watching her, she smiled, that sleepy, unguarded smile that made his heart clench. "Good morning," she murmured. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months, years maybe." She stretched cat-like, then sat up suddenly, energized despite the early hour. "We're getting married today." "We are. If you haven't changed your mind—" "Changed my mind, Caleb Rowan. I'm not letting you back out now." She was already moving, straightening her dress, finger-combing her hair. "You need to go find Reverend Matthews while I figure out what I'm going to wear." "Oh God, what am I going to wear? I don't have a wedding dress. I didn't plan for this. He caught her hand, stopping her nervous spiral. "Evelyn, breathe. We don't need anything fancy. You could wear a potato sack and you'd still be the most beautiful bride Montana Territory has ever seen." "That's sweet, but I'm not wearing a potato sack to my wedding." She took a deep breath, visibly calming herself. "All right, one step at a time. You go talk to Reverend Matthews. I'll figure out the dress situation. We'll meet at the church at noon." "Noon, that gives us—" He checked his pocket watch, 4 hours. "Think that's enough time?" "It'll have to be." She kissed him quickly, then pushed him toward the door. "Go." And Caleb, "Thank you for being brave enough to ask me, for being willing to take this leap with me. Thank you for saying yes, for seeing something in me worth saving." He left the teacherage as the town was just beginning to wake smoke rising from chimneys, the occasional door opening as people ventured out to check the snow or fetch firewood. Caleb made his way to Reverend Matthew's small house beside the church, his boots crunching in the fresh powder, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. The Reverend answered his knock in a dressing gown, his gray hair standing on end, but his eyes sharpened with interest when he saw who stood on his doorstep. "Caleb Rowan. Merry Christmas. I don't suppose you're here to discuss theology at 7 in the morning." "No, sir. I'm here to ask if you'd be willing to perform a wedding. Today. At noon, if possible." Reverend Matthew's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Today, Christmas Day, my boy, that's rather sudden." "I know, but I asked Miss Mercer to marry me last night, and neither of us wants to wait. We've both waited long enough for happiness. Seems foolish to delay now that we've found it." The Reverend studied him for a long moment, then smiled warmly. "You love her, more than I thought I could love anyone. And she loves you. She says she does. God knows why, but she does." "Then I'd be honored to perform the ceremony." Reverend Matthews stepped back to let Caleb inside. Come in. Let's discuss the details. Do you have witnesses?" "The law requires at least 2. "I was hoping we could ask whoever's available. Floyd and Ida, maybe. Doc Pritchard. I suspect once word gets out, you'll have the entire town wanting to witness this union." The Reverend poured them both coffee from the pot that sat warming on his stove. "Bramble Creek has been waiting for this, you know. Waiting for you to find your way back to life, waiting for Miss Mercer to find her place here. This wedding will be quite the Christmas gift for everyone." Caleb hadn't thought about it that way, but he supposed the Reverend was right. The town had invested in their story, had rooted for them from that first evening. His marriage to Evelyn would be a celebration not just for them, but for the entire community. They spent the next hour working out the details of the ceremony. Reverend Matthews would keep it simple but meaningful, incorporating traditional vows while acknowledging the unique circumstances that had brought Caleb and Evelyn together. Noon in the church. Caleb would ask Floyd to stand as his best man. Evelyn could choose whomever she wished. "One more thing," the Reverend said as Caleb prepared to leave. "Have you thought about rings?" Caleb's stomach sank. He hadn't. In the rush of proposing and planning an immediate wedding, he'd completely forgotten about rings. "No, I don't. Where would I even get rings on Christmas morning?" "I may be able to help with that." Reverend Matthews disappeared into his bedroom and returned a moment later with a small wooden box. Inside were 2 simple gold bands, slightly worn but still beautiful. "These belonged to my parents. They had a long, happy marriage 53 years before my father passed, and my mother only lasted 6 months without him. They'd want these rings to be used by another couple starting their life together." "Reverend, I can't take your parents' rings." "You can, and you will. Consider it a Christmas gift, or a wedding present, or simply an old man's desire to see these rings symbolize love again." He pressed the box into Caleb's hands. "Besides, something tells me my mother would have liked Miss Mercer very much." They were both strong women who chose to be brave even when the world told them to be afraid. Caleb's throat tightened with emotion. Thank you. This means more than you know. Just promise me you'll take care of that young woman. She's been through enough pain. Give her the happiness she deserves. I promise. With everything I have, I promise. Caleb's next stop was the Silver Spur, where he found Floyd already up and preparing for what he'd assumed would be a quiet Christmas day with minimal customers. The bartender's face lit up when Caleb explained the situation. Married today, hot. Damn, I knew you'd come around, but I didn't think it'd be this fast. Floyd grabbed Caleb in a bear hug, pounding his back enthusiastically. Of course I'll stand up with you. Honored to do it. And Caleb, I'm real happy for you. You deserve this. I don't know about deserve, but I'm grateful for it. Same thing near enough. Floyd was already moving his mind, clearly racing ahead to logistics. I don't want to help Miss Mercer. Get ready. And we should probably tell folks, let them know there's going to be a wedding. Town will want to celebrate. Reverend Matthews said the same thing, but Floyd, we're keeping it simple. No big production, no fancy anything. Just a ceremony and maybe a reception at the saloon after. Floyd interrupted his tone, brooking no argument. Caleb, you're getting married. The town will want to celebrate with you. Let us do this. Let us give you and Miss Mercer a proper start. Looking at his friend's earnest face, Caleb found he couldn't say no. These people cared about him, about Evelyn. They wanted to be part of this moment. Who was he to deny them that, all right, a reception at the saloon, but nothing too elaborate? I'll keep it reasonable. Now go, you probably want to clean up before your wedding. Can't have the groom looking like he slept in his clothes, even if he did. Word spread through Bramble Creek with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By the time Caleb made it back to his ranch to shave change into his best clothes and ride back to town, it seemed like everyone knew about the wedding. He passed the Thompsons on the road, and they called out congratulations. Samuel Chen was already putting up decorations outside his store. Even old Doc Pritchard, who Caleb encountered on the street, grinned and slapped him on the shoulder. Told you she was good for you, Doc said. And I'm collecting my $20 from that betting pool, by the way. Knew you'd propose before New Year's. At the teacherage, Evelyn was surrounded by what appeared to be every woman in Bramble Creek. Through the window, Caleb could see Mrs. Sullivan directing operations like a general, while Ida fussed with Evelyn's hair, and Mrs. Chen held up various pieces of fabric. He wisely decided not to interrupt, instead heading to the church to help Reverend Matthews prepare the space. The small white church had been decorated for Christmas pine boughs, and red ribbons adorned the pews, candles waited to be lit, and someone had already started a fire in the pot-bellied stove to ward off the cold. Caleb and the Reverend worked together to clear a space at the front to make sure there would be room for witnesses to create a setting that felt special despite the hasty planning. Floyd arrived around 11 with several bottles of good wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. Doc Pritchard showed up with his wife, both dressed in their Sunday best. The Martinez family came followed by the Chens, the Thompsons, the Hendersons, with baby Hope sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. By 12:45, the church was packed with what appeared to be the entire population of Bramble Creek, all dressed in their finest, all buzzing with excitement and genuine joy. Caleb stood at the front of the church, Floyd beside him, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years, a sense of belonging so complete it brought tears to his eyes. These people had seen him at his lowest, had respected his need for isolation, but had never given up on him. And now they were here to celebrate his new beginning, to witness his marriage to the woman who'd changed everything. Nervous, Floyd asked quietly. Terrified, Caleb admitted. What if I mess this up? What if I can't be the husband she deserves? You won't mess it up, and you'll be exactly the husband she deserves because she chose you knowing everything about you, the good, the bad, the broken pieces. That's what love is, Caleb. It's choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. Before Caleb could respond, the church door opened and Evelyn appeared. She was breathtaking. Mrs. Sullivan and the other ladies had worked magic in just a few hours. Evelyn wore a dress of ivory silk that Caleb learned later had been Mrs. Sullivan's own wedding dress, altered to fit Evelyn's slighter frame. Her hair was swept up in an elaborate arrangement woven through with small white flowers that Ida had somehow produced despite the snow. She carried a simple bouquet of evergreen and winter berries, and her face glowed with such radiant happiness that Caleb forgot to breathe. Mrs. Pritchard began playing the small organ, a traditional hymn transformed into a wedding march, and Evelyn walked down the aisle alone, no father to give her away but needing no one. She walked toward him with her head high, and her eyes locked on his, and Caleb felt the last of his walls crumble completely. When she reached the front of the church, she handed her bouquet to Ida, who'd agreed to stand as her witness, and took Caleb's hands. Hers were trembling slightly, and he squeezed gently, offering silent reassurance. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, his voice warm and carrying easily through the packed church. "We are gathered here today in the presence of God and this community to join Caleb Rowan and Evelyn Mercer in holy matrimony. That they have chosen to make this commitment on Christmas Day, the day we celebrate the greatest gift ever given, seems particularly fitting. For love itself is a gift, one we don't always recognize when it arrives, one we sometimes fear to accept, but one that has the power to transform us utterly." The Reverend spoke about the journey that had brought them to this moment, about the courage it took to love after loss, about the grace of second chances. He talked about community and support, about the town's role in nurturing this relationship. And then he looked at Caleb and Evelyn with gentle wisdom. "Caleb, Evelyn, you've both known profound pain. You've both survived circumstances that would have broken lesser people. And now you stand here choosing to build a life together, choosing hope over fear, love over loneliness. That choice, that daily moment-by-moment choice to choose each other, is what marriage really is." He guided them through their vows, the traditional words taking on new meaning when spoken by two people who'd fought so hard to reach this moment. When Caleb promised to love and cherish Evelyn in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death parted them, his voice was strong and sure. He meant every word with a depth of conviction that surprised even himself. Evelyn's vows were equally powerful, her voice clear despite the tears streaming down her face. "I, Evelyn, take you, Caleb, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand by your side through whatever comes to remind you of your worth, when you forget to love you not despite your scars, but because of everything you've overcome. I choose you today and every day after, for as long as we both shall live." When it came time for rings, Caleb produced the box Reverend Matthews had given him. Evelyn's eyes widened when she saw the simple gold bands, understanding immediately the significance of the gift. Caleb slipped the smaller ring onto her finger, his hand steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, the ancient words feeling brand new. "All that I am, all that I have, I give to you." Evelyn repeated the gesture, sliding the larger band onto his finger, and Caleb felt the weight of it, not heavy, but substantial, a tangible reminder of the commitment they were making. "By the power vested in me by Montana Territory, and by God," Reverend Matthews declared, his voice ringing through the church, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb cupped Evelyn's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears, and kissed her with all the love and promise and desperate gratitude he felt. The church erupted in applause and cheers, but Caleb barely heard it. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in his arms, his wife, the person who'd walked into his life without asking permission and changed absolutely everything. When they finally broke apart, both laughing through their tears, Reverend Matthews presented them to the congregation. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Rowan." The applause grew louder, and Caleb and Evelyn walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, greeting their friends and neighbors, accepting congratulations and well wishes. Outside the church, the snow had stopped, and weak winter sunlight broke through the clouds, making the white-covered town sparkle as if dusted with diamonds. Floyd had arranged for several wagons to transport everyone to the Silver Spur for the reception, but Caleb lifted Evelyn onto his horse instead, swinging up behind her, wanting these few moments alone with his wife before joining the celebration. They rode slowly through the streets, savoring the quiet, the feeling of her leaning back against him, the knowledge that they'd actually done it, they'd gotten married, started their life together, made their private love public and permanent. "Mrs. Rowan," Caleb said, testing the name. "How does that sound?" "Perfect," Evelyn replied, turning her head to kiss his jaw. "Absolutely perfect." The Silver Spur had been transformed in the few hours since Caleb had last seen it. Garlands of evergreen draped every surface, candles flickered on every table, and someone had strung white ribbons from the ceiling beams, creating a canopy effect that made the usually rough-hewn saloon look almost elegant. The tables had been pushed together to create one long surface already laden with food that the townspeople had contributed: roasted meats and fresh bred vegetables and desserts, everything a wedding feast should be. Floyd and Ida had outdone themselves. As Caleb and Evelyn entered, Floyd raised his glass. To the bride and groom, to Caleb and Evelyn Rowan. May your love continue to grow stronger with each passing day, and may you never forget the community that stands ready to support you. To Caleb and Evelyn. The crowd echoed, raising their own glasses. The celebration that followed was joyous and heartfelt. There was music. Samuel Chen played fiddle, while Doc Pritchard surprised everyone by producing a harmonica and providing accompaniment. There was dancing. Caleb, who'd claimed he couldn't dance, found himself spinning Evelyn around the makeshift dance floor with surprising grace. There were toasts and stories and laughter, so much laughter that Caleb's face hurt from smiling. At one point, Mrs. Sullivan pulled Evelyn aside for a private word, and Caleb watched as the older woman handed his wife a handkerchief, both of them wiping away tears. Later, Mrs. Sullivan told him she'd been welcoming Evelyn formally into the community, telling her that Bramble Creek took care of its own and that she'd never be alone again. Doc Pritchard cornered Caleb near the bar, pressing a small bag of coins into his hand. Your share of the betting pool. Figured you might as well benefit from everyone's speculation about your love life. Doc, I can't take this. You can and you will. Use it to buy something nice for your wife. Speaking of which, Doc's expression turned serious. I meant what I said all those weeks ago. She's good for you, Caleb. You're a different man than you were 2 months ago. Lighter, somehow. Like you finally set down a burden you've been carrying too long. I have Rebecca Morrison's parents to visit, Caleb said quietly, speaking the thought that had been forming in his mind since last night. Come spring, when the pass is clear, I need to go to Helena. Need to apologize in person, face to face. Need to tell them about Evelyn, about trying to build a life worth living. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need them to know that their daughter's death mattered, that it changed me, that I haven't forgotten her. Doc nodded slowly. That takes courage. But I think you're right, you need that closure. And Caleb, I think you'll find the Morrisons more understanding than you expect. Grief makes people bitter sometimes, but it can also make them wise. As the afternoon wore into evening, the celebration showed no signs of slowing. Children played games in the corner while their parents talked and laughed around the tables. Floyd kept the drinks flowing, but responsibly making sure everyone was merry, but not drunk. Ida circulated with endless platters of food, refusing all attempts to help, insisting that feeding people was her gift to the newlyweds. Billy Thompson approached Caleb and Evelyn shyly, holding something wrapped in brown paper. Mr. Rowan, Miss Mercer, Mrs. Rowan, me, and the other kids, we made you something. Evelyn unwrapped the package to reveal a wooden plaque, obviously handcrafted with the Rowan family, burned into the surface in careful letters. Around the words, the children had carved various designs books for Evelyn's teaching a horse, for Caleb's ranch, a star like the one from the Christmas pageant, and hearts, so many hearts. Billy, this is beautiful, Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. Did you make this yourself? Well, Emma helped with the design, and Mr. Chen at the store let us use his wood-burning tools, and my pa helped with the carving, but yeah, mostly me. Billy shuffled his feet, pleased but embarrassed by the attention. We just wanted you to know that we're glad you're both staying in Bramble Creek, that we're glad you found each other. Caleb had to clear his throat before he could speak. Thank you, Billy. This means a lot. We'll hang it in our home, wherever that ends up being. As Billy scampered back to his friends, Evelyn leaned into Caleb's side. Our home, she repeated softly. We need to figure that out, don't we? Your ranch? Or the teacherage? Or both? Caleb said, the solution suddenly obvious. You need to be near the school during the week, and I need to manage the ranch. We'll split our time. I'll take Mrs. Sullivan up on her offer for the carpentry work, spend more time in town. Maybe eventually we'll build something bigger, something that's truly ours. But for now, we'll make do with what we have. Wate, together. Evelyn said the word. They kept coming back to the word that defined their new reality. Together. As the sun set and the celebration finally began to wind down, Reverend Matthews called for everyone's attention one more time. Before we conclude this joyous day, I'd like to share a final thought. Caleb and Evelyn's story reminds us that it's never too late for new beginnings, that love can find us in the darkest moments if we're brave enough to recognize it, that community matters, that second chances are real, and that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the greatest blessings. He raised his glass once more. To Caleb and Evelyn Rowan, may your marriage be long and happy, may your love continue to inspire this community, and may you always remember this Christmas day when you chose each other and chose hope. The final toast was drunk, and then the crowd began to disperse, families heading home to their own celebrations, couples walking hand in hand through the snow-covered streets. Floyd and Ida insisted on cleaning up themselves, shooing Caleb and Evelyn out into the night. They walked to the teacherage in the darkness, the stars brilliant overhead, their breath creating clouds in the cold air. Neither spoke, both lost in the magnitude of what had happened, the irrevocable change they'd made to their lives. When they reached Evelyn's door, their door now, Caleb supposed, she turned to face him. "I can't quite believe it's real," she said, "that we're actually married, that I'm your wife and you're my husband." "Believe it." Caleb pulled her close, his arms around her waist. "This is real, Evelyn. More real than anything I've felt in 8 years. You're mine and I'm yours, and we're going to figure out this life together." "I love you," she whispered, rising on her toes to kiss him. "So very much. I love you too, more than words can say." They went inside, leaving the door closed on the outside world, ready to begin their first night as husband and wife. And as Caleb held Evelyn in the quiet warmth of their home, he thought about the journey that had brought them here, the pain and loss, the years of isolation, the chance encounter in a crowded saloon when a brave woman had sat down without asking permission. That decision, that single moment of courage from Evelyn, had changed everything, had given him back his life, his hope, his belief that he deserved happiness, had shown him that love was worth the risk, that second chances were real, that it was never too late to come in from the cold. Spring arrived in Montana with the explosive force it always did, transforming the landscape from white and dormant to green and bursting with life, seemingly overnight. The creeks ran high with snowmelt wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and Bramble Creek came alive with renewed energy after the long winter. Caleb and Evelyn settled into their life together with surprising ease, finding a rhythm that worked for both of them. During the week, Caleb stayed in town working on the school improvements and taking on other carpentry projects that Mrs. Sullivan and the town council kept finding for him. He'd become an official part of Bramble Creek's community, no longer on the outskirts, but fully integrated, helping with barn raisings and church repairs and all the small tasks that held a town together. On weekends, they retreated to the ranch where Evelyn learned to ride properly, and Caleb taught her about managing cattle and horses. They worked side by side in the garden she'd planted, growing vegetables for their own table and to share with neighbors. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about their days, making plans for the future. In early April, Caleb made the trip to Helena that he'd been planning since Christmas. Evelyn offered to come with him, but he knew this was something he needed to do alone. The Morrisons received him with understandable coldness at first, but when he explained what had happened from his perspective, when he showed them the depth of his remorse and told them about Evelyn and his new life, something shifted. Rebecca's mother had wept, but not from anger. "She wouldn't want you destroying yourself over this," Mrs. Morrison had said. Rebecca believed in second chances and forgiveness. She'd want you to live, Mr. Rowan, to love and be loved, to make something good out of something terrible. The conversation hadn't erased Caleb's guilt entirely. He suspected he'd carry some measure of that burden for the rest of his life. But it had lifted, this crushing weight of it had allowed him to finally forgive himself just enough to move forward without constantly looking back. When he returned to Bramble Creek, Evelyn had been waiting at the teacherage, and he'd told her everything. They'd held each other and cried together, and he'd felt another piece of his broken soul heal. By late May, Evelyn had begun to suspect she might be pregnant. Doc Pritchard confirmed it in early June, and the news had sent Caleb into a tailspin of emotions, joy and terror, and overwhelming love all mixed together. They'd be parents by the new year. They'd bring a child into the world, a symbol of their love and their second chances. The town celebrated their news almost as enthusiastically as they'd celebrated the wedding. Mrs. Sullivan immediately began organizing a quilting bee to make baby blankets. Ida started collecting baby clothes from families whose children had outgrown them. Floyd impossibly became even more protective of Evelyn, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a teacup when she came to the saloon. "You're all ridiculous," Evelyn told them, laughing, one hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid." "You're carrying Bramble Creek's first second-generation baby," Mrs. Sullivan declared. "At least the first one where we all got to watch the parents fall in love. That makes you special." On a warm evening in late June, Caleb and Evelyn sat on the bench he'd built overlooking the valley from their ranch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and wildflowers swayed in the gentle breeze. Evelyn leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, both of them content in the comfortable silence they'd mastered. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Evelyn asked quietly. "If I hadn't walked into that saloon, if I'd been too intimidated to sit at your table—" "Every day," Caleb admitted. "I think about how close I came to spending the rest of my life alone. How close I came to missing you missing everything we've built together. I think about it too, about how one moment of courage, of desperation, of just being too exhausted to care about propriety led to everything." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "I was so scared that night, Caleb, terrified of my new life, of failing, of never finding a place to belong. And then you let me stay. You didn't have to, but you did. Best decision I ever made." "Second best," she corrected with a smile. "The best was asking me to marry you." "Fair point." He kissed her forehead, then let his hand drift down to rest on her stomach, marveling at the life growing there. "We're going to be parents." "We are. Are you ready?" "Absolutely terrified. But yeah, I think I'm ready." He paused, then added, "With you, I'm ready for anything." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun completed its descent and the first stars began to appear. The valley below was peaceful, the ranch animals settling for the night, the distant lights of Bramble Creek visible in the gathering darkness. Everything was exactly as it should be. Caleb thought about that first night, about the lonely man he'd been, about the woman who'd sat down without asking and shattered his carefully constructed isolation. He thought about the journey they'd taken together, the healing they'd found in each other, the community that had supported them. He thought about the future stretching ahead, uncertain, challenging, but no longer terrifying because they'd face it together. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For being brave enough to sit at my table, for not giving up on me when I tried to push you away, for choosing me, choosing this life, choosing us." Evelyn turned in his arms, cupping his face in her hands. "Thank you for letting me in, for loving me despite everything, for giving me a home when I thought I'd lost everything." They kissed as the stars emerged overhead, two broken people who'd found wholeness in each other, two lost souls who'd discovered that home wasn't a place, but a person, a choice, a commitment made new every single day. And Caleb knew with absolute certainty, sitting there with his wife in his arms and his child growing inside her, that he would never eat alone again. He'd never sit in isolation, never cut himself off from the world, never choose loneliness over love. Because Evelyn had shown him that second chances were real, that healing was possible, that it was never too late to come in from the cold and join the warmth of life, of community, of love. The cowboy who'd eaten alone for 8 long years had finally found his home, and it was more beautiful, more complete, more full of hope than he'd ever dared to imagine. As the Montana night embraced them with its familiar chill and brilliant stars, Caleb Rowan held his wife close and silently thanked whatever force of fate or providence or simple blessed chance had brought her into his life. The future was uncertain, as all futures were, but for the first time in 8 years he was ready to face it. Not alone, never alone again. Together.